So, hello friends, and welcome to Broadcasts from Fiddler's Green, my weekly podcast here on the channel The Distributist. So, once more, usually I give a monologue at the beginning of these things, and this weekend, which is Labor Day weekend, I kind of got flat-footed. Since it's 2020, it's impossible to go at least 2 weeks without getting sick. My wife and I had the misfortune of getting a bad bout of food poisoning. So I ended up finding myself on Monday night having written absolutely zero notes and not knowing at all what I would do a lecture on, a monologue on for this podcast. So I solicited people's opinions on Telegram or wherever. It's the one thing I really use that site for anymore. And I soon discovered that most people wanted really wholesome conversations from me about culture. I think people were tired of politics. I also discovered when I asked this question that the more wholesome the topic, the more deep it was, the more impossible it was to actually prepare something ad hoc on the fly. So last night I resigned myself to just go completely bottom of the barrel and talk about culture and if there's any possibility of culture post the Great Awakening. And as my little thumbnail, I include a picture of the thing that everyone's talking about, which is, of course, Amazon's new wokeified Lord of the Rings. There were some interesting online conversations about it, not the least triggered by the fact that Amazon is literally censoring comments, which is, again, nothing new. But man, I was really struggling on what to say about this, because what can you say about the woke cultural phenomenon, or trying to get past it, that hasn't already been said by everyone else? What can you say? Everyone knows the routine by now. Everyone knows what it feels like, not only to get something that you really like kind of dismantled and deconstructed in this way and sold back to you as something that's good for you. What really kind of twists the knife, so to speak, is the fact that you have to get lectured by all of the people, all of the creators, all of the celebrities that made culture previously that you enjoyed and that gave your life meaning, and now are here to tell you that if you don't have the same preferences in terms of character designs and retelling stories and redesigning stories and racially rediversifying things in ways that was obviously not intended by the author, then you're a terrible person. Never read their work again. You should go away. You're basically a semi-fascist. Whatnot. And this is the whole routine that was going on. And I was kind of mulling it over today, trying to figure out what exactly I was going to talk about. And I increasingly wanted to just talk about one particular piece of fiction, one particular text that's given my life meaning, and that was really, it was kind of a transitional text for me. It was something that it was one of the things that paved the way from my teenage years to my college years, and kind of set me on the path of being interested in deeper material. And it's a really odd one, because I wasn't really thinking about it. Two things set me off. The first one was a question that came up on my stream with Fritz Imperial the other day. I think it was about 2 or 3 days ago, where I can't forget who asked this question, but the question was asked, what's the last piece of culture you can remember seeing or experiencing that you think is really going to be meaningful and carry forward in your life? How far back do you have to go to get to one of those really seminal pieces of culture that really excited your imagination? And this title came up, the one that I'm about to show you. The other thing that kicked it off was that I literally had to sit through Twitter controversies or Telegram controversies where this guy was lecturing me on what a piece of shit I was, because I wasn't watching the new Lord of the Rings of Power stuff with the massively uncanonical takes on what Tolkien imagined for his universe. And this is so you might realize that I'm referencing the comic writer and then subsequently young adult writer Neil Gaiman. And the specific text I'm citing here is Neil Gaiman's Sandman. I'm holding a copy of it here. Neil Gaiman's Sandman is so this is one volume here. It's a comic book, certainly. It was a series of comics that came out in the late 90s. Actually, I think it was the mid-90s, come to think of it. It came out in the mid-90s, way before my time sort of reading comics written for adults, or graphic novels as they're now known. And this was sort of a seminal, I think after Alan Moore, this was sort of a seminal transition from this idea that comics were more or less a superhero medium with some satirical dimensions to them, to something that was actually for adults. It was actually could communicate serious, philosophically deep fictional stories. Obviously, comics have been used carrying these sort of deep philosophical fictional stories for a very long time in countries that weren't America, and France most notably. But this is a really, in the 80s and 90s, this was a really novel idea for Americans, that we would have superhero comics that would straddle the line between being silly and being actually for adults. And Neil Gaiman was tasked with rewriting, I believe, the DC hero Sandman, which is sort of this, I think he's just this hero that puts people to sleep, and like he's part of the Justice League or something. And instead, when Neil Gaiman got this project, because he was given such a broad leeway with the project, he decided to just scrap the entire idea and do a series of comics about the Sandman, the Lord of Dreams, the literal god that controls people's sleep patterns and designs the dreams that they experience. And because this is part of a DC commission, it was inside the DC universe. So it starts out as this really bizarre set of escapades that this character, the god of dreams, takes inside the DC universe. Like literally Batman and Superman are in the background of a lot of these stories. You have DC characters like John Constantine and the Scarecrow and Dr. Destiny is one of the original villains that he fights. And he goes on this Neil Gaiman, I think, was relatively unknown at this time. He was just sort of this weird British short story writer. And he takes it down this weird route where instead of telling a story about a superhero, he basically just gives you a retelling of Aleister Crowley's rise and fall, and the rise and fall of sort of not Satanism but occultism in the 1930s in Britain, and its eventual absorption into sort of the 1960s grift Satanism that it eventually became. And this is just the first volume of this set. And I remember coming across this series, and I had no idea what to make of it. I wandered into my local comic shop when I was like 16, I think, and I don't know what prompted me to ask this question because I wasn't a real big comics guy. And I asked the guy who owned the comic shop, who was sort of a friend of mine. He was an adult, obviously, so I didn't know him that well. I'm like, oh man, I want a really good graphic novel. What can you recommend? And the guy tells me, as I think all comic book stores owners would probably tell you in 2000 or wherever this was, oh man, you've got to read Neil Gaiman's Sandman. It's just the best graphic novel series of all time. I read the first volume. I have no idea what to make of it. And it's strange because Neil Gaiman, I mean, it was strange at the time because this slowly became a pattern for Neil Gaiman and kind of all postmodern writers, is that what you sort of realize is that this is not a linear story about a character. Certainly the main character, the Sandman, Morpheus, I believe as he's called by most people, or the Lord of Dreams, he's sort of the main character, but mainly he's just in the background of various stories that are told surrounding dreams. And he kind of moves through the universe, and if you read enough of these short stories, a coherent story starts building up. But more or less, in any given section, it just feels like a short story. And in Neil Gaiman's style, every short story is literally a reference to some other piece of culture or deeper literary author. And of course, as a very precocious young man, I'm recognizing a lot of these are going straight over my head. I don't realize that the first volume is about Aleister Crowley. Maybe I knew who Aleister Crowley was at that stage, but I really didn't have much of a connection to it. And so you're getting this weird story, and it kind of was like a mind-blowing experience for me. It was satisfying, I should say. I think I got through the first 4 of them, and that was sort of completed the first arc that Neil Gaiman wants to tell you about the Sandman and the universe, and then the politics that goes around these immortal beings. One of them, the main guy who controls dreams. And I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. But I don't really see what the point is. I don't really see what the point of all of this is. Some of the stories were really good. Some of the individual short stories were quite profound, and they felt deep, and they felt like they were actually alluding to something that was more interesting. But right around the 4th volume of the Sandman series, right after the first arc kind of crests, and you're thinking, okay, what could possibly come next? I got kind of bored of it. I thought, well, this is really competently done. This is really expanding the horizons of what it means to make graphic novels into art, what it means to take comics seriously. All teenagers, when they're in this phase, or at least in the late 90s, early 2000s, they're so concerned that either animation or comics or science fiction, like, it wasn't being taken seriously enough. And what we really needed was some genre-defying, deep philosophical, take on these classic nerd culture mediums to really make it respectable and bring it into the mainstream and make everyone realize that this was a really serious thing that needed really serious people to pay attention to it, right? And of course, this is before the internet. So when you think this as a teenager, well, the internet was there, but it wasn't really there in a big way. But in the late 90s or early 2000s, when you thought this as a teenager, you thought this was you were one of the few people who were that really cared about this, when really all young men of your generation were thinking the exact same thing and saying the exact same thing and speaking in the same cliches and quoting about how Hayao Miyazaki is an underappreciated genius, all the while his animation gets Miramax releases in multiplexes, even though it's a foreign language animation film, and all this. But I understood this was a really deep thing. I liked Neil Gaiman's writing style, but I also didn't see the point. What Neil Gaiman was doing in the Sandman, and it hadn't really become a Neil Gaiman cliche yet, but it was something that a lot of people did back then, is they didn't really have any ideas of their own about how to progress through a story. So what they would do is they would sew one together through a lot of different references to more classic forms of media, and they create a patchwork world where there'd be some beings from Egyptian mythology and some beings from Greek mythology and some beings from the Christian, I don't want to say pantheon, obviously, because that's a misnomer, but they would all be kind of sewn together in this collective universe. And this would kind of be this postmodern take. It could all be real. It could all be true at once. And this is what it's like to be in the postmodern universe. And okay, fine, fair enough. But what was missing, I guess, was from all of this was a certain amount of depth, a certain amount of feeling like there could be permanence and there could be something that connects you to the outside world. The stories, though. So after the fourth one, I finally kind of proceeded onward, and the stories got significantly better because the author, Neil Gaiman, starts to actually take himself a little bit more seriously. This is something that I think is underappreciated about Neil Gaiman, at least in the early days, is that he wasn't simply somebody who was sewing together references to other pieces of fantasy, to other pieces of mythology. I always felt that way about Terry Pratchett, who authored a lot of different books with Neil Gaiman later in his life, that Terry Pratchett was more or less just a postmodern joker. He didn't really have any good ideas. He just took elements from various Grimm's fairy tales, put a postmodern veneer on them, gave them a lot of snarky lines that sounded out of place in the context of a fantasy novel, and then boom, you've got The Colors of Magic, or half the novels that come out of the Discworld series. And that's basically Terry Pratchett in a nutshell. And Neil Gaiman basically the same thing, except this time, as opposed to having a fantasy veneer, he's got an urban fantasy veneer. Everything takes place in the contemporary world. And but what kind of surprised me as the Sandman went on was that I caught a whiff of something, a thread that not all of the mythological elements that were going on were so easily dismissible. Neil Gaiman felt that there was something that was solid. There was something that you could push back on in the spiritual world, and it wouldn't just give away. It wasn't like the gods only existed when you believed in them. Maybe they did in Neil Gaiman's universe. That's implied in many cases throughout the story, that all of these different mythological elements only exist because the mortals actually believe in them. But even that, there was some deep spiritual reality that you couldn't cross. There were lines you couldn't cross. There were barriers you couldn't erase with your will. This wasn't just a fantasy, and that the author himself, Neil Gaiman, felt that it was important that we come into communion or understand this deeper spiritual reality. And this really started taking shape in the later sections of this series. I can't really go into it too much without referencing characters, but I remember at one point in the middle book of this series, you encounter this witch character, And this witch character, okay, you think that she's a feminist witch character, right? How many? Stop me, you guys, if you haven't heard this one before, right? Have you ever heard? This is an insane idea. An ancient witch character who practices magic in the modern world, but she's a feminist, like blindingly original. Okay, so not that much to write home about there. But the trick that makes it really kind of juicy is that Neil Gaiman invests this witch simultaneously with sort of these brutally pagan and survivalistic ethics that seem very ancient. This is she looks like some kind of Gloria Steinem carbon copy, maybe more bookish. Power politics for the Sandman kind of captured my imagination, where okay, like this isn't just postmodern bullshit anymore. Maybe this has something that's actually important to say. Because what if, past all this postmodern stuff, there actually is a deeper spiritual reality? And what's so funny is that, like, I seem to remember in this very book, there's a trans character. Like, this is before its time, but Neil Gaiman was literally, since he had an urban fantasy setting, there was a trans character that was trying to practice magic with this witch, who had this deeply feminine power, and the witch just kicks her out because she's not an actual woman. Like, the witch is literally like, you're not an actual woman, you can't wield the magic of the feminine, get out. I mean, that would get Neil Gaiman canceled these days, but like it was this moment where, and it's treated somewhat like sympathetically from the perspective of this trans character, but Neil Gaiman is trying to contrast the sort of superficial ways we conceptualize things in the modern world with the deeper ways they were practiced in the ancient world. And he seemed to understand this. Like this was a core element of his own genre of fiction. And what gave the Sandman its real interest was that it wasn't completely superficial how these things played out. It wasn't completely transparent, and it wasn't completely transparent that this was just a dream reality. And so as the series progressed, like you can actually get drawn into the thing. And losing my train of thought uncharacteristically, but I remember thinking that this was somebody who kind of really got it. Neil Gaiman was someone to pay attention to because he was actually curious about real things. And an encouraging element, one odd thing about him, was that he kind of had this ability to parse out authors and to kind of give them their due. The name of this channel, actually, Fiddler's Green, is a reference to the character that G.K. Chesterton that Neil Gaiman inserts in his Sandman series. That it literally is a carbon copy of G.K. Chesterton. And it's actually how I found out about G.K. Chesterton to begin with. And Gaiman talks about Chesterton as a character who was a true believer. And initially, when I heard about interviews from Neil Gaiman, and when I followed up on my research reading The Sandman, which is always the most fun part, Neil Gaiman was like sincerely interested that Chesterton had a devout belief in what he was talking about. And he actually dedicated his most popular book, Good Omens, of G.K. Chesterton, saying to Gilbert, who knew what was going on. And for a while I'm thinking, okay, well, as you're marching through the 2000s and you see postmodernism ramping up, you kind of, there was this feeling that, okay, well, there are people here that actually care about truth and actually care about touching reality in a real way. And they kind of can hold back the madness. And slowly sort of these illusions boil away. It's strange because the other great Neil Gaiman book that I really remember reading was Coraline, which was turned into a pretty good movie also. And again, the same deliciousness, the same thing I really liked in Sandman was in display again in Coraline, which was girl encounters spook, girl encounters alternative universe from the modern world. Again, cliche. What's not cliche is that the alternative universe is demonic. It's way deeper and way more real than what you're initially expected to handle. The creature she unleashes isn't a kind of fairy tale villain, but just a straight up demon that wants to drain her soul. And so the feeling that and this is the same feeling that Sandman evokes. The feeling is, okay, you step off into this imaginary reality that's kind of like a game, and then instead of going like a few steps down into the kiddie pool, you just sink right into the deep end, and you find yourself in a universe that's way more consequential, and way more real, and way more mortal in both senses of the word, deadly and also human, than anything you would have expected from the cover. And I'm like, and I thought to myself, if Neil Gaiman explores this in his work, he could come to some really interesting conclusions. And then, what can I say? Then the 2000s happened, and everything kind of rolls up in the opposite direction. The authors who seem to be opening the doors to the past, who seem to be opening the doors to the deeper realities and the places that you couldn't go in the modern world, then started to slowly close them and seal them, almost as if they were worried about some demon escaping into the modern world and ruining the paradise we had created. Neil Gaiman matched, he married the lead singer of the Dresden Dolls, which I always kind of attribute his decline to, who even before I think she met Neil Gaiman was kind of known for being this insufferably political person, and who had kind of these awful political opinions before awful, affluent white female liberal was known to be a thing. And slowly Neil Gaiman goes from being this person who used postmodernism and references to things liberally to kind of open a door into things that were deeper and more ancient and more true, to somebody who's just, again, doing the same thing that we know and love in the modern world, giving us a little exhibit of culture on rails. And you go past the exhibit that shows you the Egyptian gods, and you learn a fact about Ra and Seth and Osiris, and then you go on to the next exhibit, and the It's a Small World After All, and you go through all the various varieties of mythology, but at the same time, nothing is ever meaningful. There can be no consequences in this universe. The whole reason why Sandman was fun, or that it felt deeper than it actually seemed on the surface, was that it implied that there could be eternal consequences and true spirituality. That the postmodernism that was used as a motif was just a veil to conquer more real things. And it's funny because I was on Twitter in the morning, and I had another question about a political matter, and this was the ongoing conflict between the YouTuber or Twitch streamer Keffels, who is this sort of detestable individual who is this transgender person who has made it their task to basically ratio people and create hate mobs against right-wingers, while at the same time mailing HRT to underage children. This should be illegal, and this person should be in jail for doing what they do, because it's medical malpractice. If this person was even a qualified medical professional, it would be medical malpractice. This person is an amateur cooking up HRT in their bathtubs and mailing it out to kids who they convince need to take them to make all their problems go away as teenagers. This shouldn't be legal. But the next crusade on this was going after Kiwi Farms, which is another degenerate site, but one that documents drama, and Keffels believed that this site needs to be taken down, or believed because the site's down now. That individual believed that the site needed to be taken down because it contained unflattering truths about this person's past. And of course, this means whenever there's an unflattering truth that one of these trans activists doesn't like, that means that the truth has to be expunged off the internet because, of course, reality is malleable. And so I think I comment on this that, that I really hate Kiwi Farms. It's a degenerate site filled with people who are posting filth. It's one of these sort of quasi-dark websites. But at the same time, I understood that this attempt to censor was going to eventually be used on activists trying to expose the malfeasance of the whole gender cult people. The fact that they're actually targeting children, the fact that they're performing surgeries on children, and the fact that they're lying about all these operations, and that they're pushing this and pushing misinformation onto children in order to convince them to make really medically unsound decisions and insane decisions, also that they can get them on board with a political movement that they'll never be able to leave because they physically scarred their own bodies in order to join it. And so I post this in the morning before I head off to work, and I get one of the most bizarre. I think it's one of the hangers-on of Keffels or whatever, but it's one of the most delicious and revealing replies ever. And the reply is, "Oh my God, you call yourself," this tweet wasn't about Neil Gaiman. "You call yourself a Neil Gaiman fan, but don't you know Neil Gaiman is all about trans rights and about LGBTQ. You're just a total poser." How could you have a Neil Gaiman character in as one of your AVIs? It's G.K. Chesterton, by the way, and not be 100% on board with the progressive agenda, you poser. And this is a little bit nuts. The idea, it's bizarre because the idea that I'm somehow on, like, Neil Gaiman now. So the idea is, but because I'm Catholic and like G.K. Chesterton, this makes me part of the fandom of Neil Gaiman, which I guess, the Fiddler's Green thing, probably like, the reference there. Okay, great. It's Neil Gaiman's reference to G.K. Chesterton. This puts me in a fandom community, and I somehow I owe this fandom community adherence to the politics of that have been newly embraced by its founder. If I reference something in the book, then I'm a poser or I'm fake if I don't go along with the politics that Neil Gaiman and his wife came up with 3 seconds ago. But that's not the real funny thing. The real funny thing is that this, I asked this person, have you ever read G.K. Chesterton? Have you ever read any of the books that are referenced in Sandman, like Moby Dick or Rudyard Kipling, where there's a whole Rudyard Kipling section, or the Arabian Nights? Have you ever read any of these classical sources? Are you aware that they contain ideas that aren't so friendly to LGBT? And they're like, "Oh, I don't care. It's not important to me. It's just the fandom. It's just you reference this thing." And I don't even really care who G.K. Chesterton is. It's just you are not in adherence with the ideology of the fan community. So you're fake. So I'm fake, which is, it's this bizarre inverted telescope. So G.K. Chesterton is Catholic and writes stories based on his Catholic theology and his contact with the real world. Neil Gaiman reads him and creates a fictionalized character that represents G.K. Chesterton and then contains wisdom and puts it in a comic book. And then this becomes a fandom community. And then this fandom community develops politics that directly contradict the original copy, the original source material that we're all referencing. Not only do they contradict the ideology of probably Neil Gaiman when he wrote the books, they contradict the ideas of G.K. Chesterton and the Catholic Church and reality itself. But no, we're not oriented towards that. The whole point is to sort of go further into the abstractions, go further into the meta-analysis, and the further into the practice of the metaverse, basically, if I could say anything else. What matters is not the real thing, but the shadow of the thing, or the shadow of the shadow of the shadow of the thing. And this is the same thing for all of this woke phenomenon. The problem is that the original creator, the original Neil Gaiman, originally his stuff worked because he was reading real literary sources and interacting with the real world. But somewhere in his career, Neil Gaiman became, he went from what he really was, which was sort of a popularizer and a remixer of ancient wisdom, to being a celebrity in his own right, to being somebody who made Neil Gaiman kind of stories, Neil Gaiman kind of stories, right? And the same thing is true for all genres. Tolkien created his stories because he wanted an actual European mythology. He wanted actual stories that a real people could tell themselves in a real physical country called England or the extended British Isles, and that represented a real historical past, a real mythopoetic past of Northern Europe. And he remixed this with his real belief religion, which was Catholicism, and he used as imagistics real places he had been in shires in England, literally calling the shire after them, and he created this thing. But somewhere over the period, the thing has become a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. At the end of the process, we're not dealing just with people who didn't grow up with Tolkien, but just his work. We're going up with people who've defined their entire identities around being a fan of the work, not just reading the work, but surrounding themselves with the pop culture of the work, the action figures, the posters, the image of Gimli with the axe and Legolas with the bow. They don't care that Legolas represents the archetype of a fey warrior, which represented in turn some classic element of warrior virtue, or some classic understanding of magic that was contained within the forest and represented in elven forms. These human but not human creatures that we cannot really, they're almost like us but not quite. That's what really gives the elves their haunting dimension. No, that's not what we remember, because we're not interested in the deeper stuff. The deeper stuff, that doesn't fit very well in a lunchbox. What fits really well in the lunchbox is, the literal action figure version of Legolas. That can be your little avatar, your little identity that you can haul around in our consumer world. And so the consumer versions of all these things become the versions that define the fandom in its totality. And so they lose their souls. They lose their reference to reality. I don't know what Legolas means to a modern Tolkien fan. Orlando Bloom doing tricks with a bow and arrow, I guess, or maybe the video game version of that or something. But there's no, how do you experience the magic of Legolas in your actual real life? What does that entail? Other than consuming products that are based on it, it's really hard to say. And the same thing is true for you can see this everywhere. Neil Gaiman's particularly bad because this is going on in the actual life of the author. But at some point, the fans of Neil Gaiman stopped actually becoming interested in what and what ideas were going on in the Sandman, and just became fans of the Sandman. The various different images that went around. So to this person messaging me back, G.K. Chesterton was not an actual person who had ideas that you might adopt in your own life. Or he didn't write actual poetry. He's just a character. He's like a character you could select on Super Smash Brothers. And since I chose his image, the G.K. Chesterton Fiddler's Green image is actually owned by Sandman registered trademark, which is in turn owned by Paramount Incorporated. So I'm using that Paramount Incorporated's intellectual property, and because of that, I have to conform to their HR department, right? It doesn't matter that the person who's representing that would have thought that the corporate HR department of this is absolutely heretical, demonic trash. It's not that. It's the fact that you are now an element of the intellectual property itself. It's captured you. It's captured you, and it's moving you in a certain direction. And if you don't conform to that, then you've betrayed the combine. You're stopping the intellectual property from growing in prominence. And if you stop the intellectual property from growing in prominence, that means you're by definition making it less serious and less important. Because you see, the nerds from the late 90s and early 2000s got their wish. All of this stuff, like the comics and the fantasy stuff and the Tolkien, it all got taken seriously. So seriously that it's become everything around us. It's become the corporations themselves. The suits stopped and listened and started cashing in. And now we're getting our wish. And our wish is that this is taken deadly seriously for all the wrong reasons. It's taken seriously as a means of political power, as a means of extending political power, but not really for the advancement of anything good, but just as a means of control, as a means of political power itself, and as a means of controlling us. The great irony in all of this is the big complaints and the big snark we had to deal with this week with the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power movie that Amazon's putting on, is that you know it from the get-go that you can't complain about race-swapped characters in movies about Northern Europeans. The articles were already ready to go. The second anybody complained about race-swapping Northern Europeans for Africans inside fiction that's based on Northern European folklore, Salon.com and Slate had all their articles, and they probably had pre-written them. They knew this backlash was coming, and the snark was already kind of loaded in your gun. Oh, why do you care about this? Why do you care about the ethnic composition of why do you care if Legolas is a Northern European or looks like he comes from the region of Earth that these stories come from? I think Matthew Iglesias, I can't remember the exact quote, but this is the most tiresome element of reaction. This world contains dragons. This world contains magic. So why can't you believe that there would be African hobbits living in a Northern European environment, distributed, not clumped up like they're an actual ethnic group, but distributed uniformly throughout the population, as if the villages were created by a medieval HR department who's making sure that the ethnic composition of all the villages, was set to meet a diversity quota. Why do you care about that? There's magic and dragons and stuff like that. That's the stupidest question in the world. The question is, Matt Iglesias, why do you care about Legolas? Why do you care about Gandalf? Why do you care about Middle-earth? Do you ever ask yourself that question? You care about these things. The reason why Tolkien wrote these things, again, is so that they could be a specific mythological representation of a specific place, a specific ethnic group in this real world we occupy. If the thing itself becomes a contradiction of that original purpose, it's doubled back on itself and it canceled itself out in a real way. The world that was meant to be a mythology of Northern Europeans and a representation of how folkways actually form cannot itself misrepresent how folkways actually look in the real world. I'll say this for one: if you were to do a rendition of a piece of Tolkien's literature, or just if you were to do like a BBC production of it in the most basic way, the nature of the Shire and characters like Tom Bombadil and how they held themselves and the way they looked and interacted with each other is more important than the fact that the dragons look realistic, or that the magic looks cool, or even that the magic's even depicted. It could be depicted off screen for all I care, because the magic isn't the point. The people are the point. The folkways are the point. The folk themselves are the point. And real folk, real people, whether they're white or brown or black, they don't look like they've been put together by a human resources department. And they don't use modern snark, and they don't mug for the camera, and they sincerely believe in religions, and they don't care about girl power, and they actually devote themselves to something that's outside of themselves. If those elements are all replaced by successor ideology, you've hollowed out the core. All you've left is sort of the sugar exterior that's designed to get us to bite down on the treat, but you've taken all of the nutrition, all of the medicine, all of the things that are supposed to give us strength, and you've replaced it with ideological trash. The diversification is the crime. I say this saying that you could create an entire series of movies in Middle Earth and make them only about African peoples. You could literally just take the camera from the northern part of Middle Earth and then zoom it down to where, Tolkien and his records had sort of the more African cultures, and just do an entire series on that, and that wouldn't have really changed anything, or really challenged the message. But what they're telling us here, and what kind of is insulting, is they're painting a frankly false picture of what it actually means to live in a community, or what it actually means to be part of a culture that has deep roots. Deep-rooted culture doesn't behave in the ways that they're trying to portray on screen. What they're portraying on screen are curated fan communities. And what they're selling us is the idea that fan communities and university undergraduate classes and these sort of little institutional holding pens that are perfectly selected and curated by corporate America and government bureaucracy, these are the same things as deeply rooted villages and tightly knit kin communities and mythology about, or myths about girl power and good versus evil Harry Potter type stories are the same thing as the myths that animated ancient peoples. This is like saying, if you have G.K. Chesterton's icon and repeat opinions G.K. Chesterton would have had, you're betraying the fan community of Neil Gaiman. It's that insane. It's an inversion of everything. That the path out of wokeness and what's happened to our generation, and I'm more or less preaching to the choir here on this one. Again, it's not a very thoroughly prepared talk tonight. But what's happened to our generation is that we really took the wrong way out of this rabbit hole we found ourselves in. We got a story like Sandman. And the whole point of Sandman was to encourage us to interact with the real world, ultimately, right? That's the point of reading. The point of reading and the point of consuming media of any kind It's so that you go out in the world you actually occupy in your community and you approach it differently. You see it with new eyes. You find your own dragons to slay, metaphorically speaking, or you use that piece of literature to connect yourself with something deeper. You read something, and this happened to me recently. You read something like Moby Dick, and then you go back and you read the Old Testament in a new way, and that happened. You read something like C.S. Lewis, and then suddenly the Psalms sound different. They sound more meaningful because it's a portal, and that in turn gets you back to the real world. That gets you back to something that actually is imminent, that makes a demand on you right now. You need to do this with your life right now. You need to interact with the world in a different way. But we took this culture and we went the exact opposite way. We just turned these things into hollow symbols of themselves, eternal self-referentials that didn't actually point to anything outside. Neil Gaiman used to be a person who was, I'm repeating myself, Neil Gaiman used to be a person who was opening doors to different worlds. Now he's the one who's shutting them. I think of that scene in Coraline where there's the door that opens up into the demonic dimension, and there's this demon trying to get out, and it's eventually sealed up and locked. Yeah, I think that's what Neil Gaiman may have discovered, that the portals he was opening led to some realities that were a little too scary for the worldview he now espouses. And now he wants all of these doors painted over with cartoon representations of what's behind them. And instead of being invited to go down one of these rabbit holes and interact with the real consequences of real world, we just kind of get wheeled through the system, and we get to see representations of them completely defanged and unmoored from the original consequence of their creation. There's no way I can really think of reading Tolkien unless you have a deep connection to both a land and a people and a faith. Certainly Tolkien himself had all of those things. He believed in the British ethnicity and its continuity. He believed devoutly in his own Latin Mass Catholicism, which, he opposed the vernacular till his dying day, as far as I know. And when he talks about the land, he's not talking about it the way Greta Thunberg does. He's talking about it because he actually took walks in the thing. He actually strolled on down to his pub and rubbed elbows with the other lower class people who were working the land and who were doing the busy work around where he lived. Was it probably in Oxford, but I believe the Shire is based on some more northern county in England. So I don't have it off the top of my head which one that is. That's the point. But now that's all being shredded. That's all being thrown away and lost to memory. The risk of the woke culture is that it creates a new iteration of individuals that understand these things only as repetitions of themselves. What does Gandalf represent? He represents Gandalf. What does Aragorn represent? He represents Aragorn. In some sense, it's funny, but Neil Gaiman might have totally cucked out, for lack of a better word, in his own life. But he's going to have a lot harder time undoing the damage he's done, because there's some un-PC stuff, by today's standards, in Sandman. There are some un-PC authors, my own avatar not certainly very much included, that said some very un-PC things that he's endorsed. And so the portal is going to be open for the curious. But what I'm always worried about is that these renditions are just ways of creating new generations that are just more and more and more isolated from the real thing. They remind me, when I say something like Lord of the Rings of Power, I was going to say Lord of the Rangs. People say the Rangs of Power, but don't cancel me, Susan, please. But when I see that now, when I see woke culture, I don't look at it as, I mean, because I don't really care. I'm not going to see them, and I'm not going to show them to my child. I'm not, and people are going to forget them very quickly. But what really worries me is that they are to our own culture like a vaccine is to a virus. A virus is very potent because it's very novel, and it's very novel, and then the novelty is what gives it its the quality that it just destroys your system instantly, right? Because your body can't react to it, it can't process it, and you're seeing something for the first time, and it just completely floors you. And oh my God, that this is beyond anything that I could have imagined, and immediately the virus takes control of your body, destroying it. But for purposes of my analogy, in culture, what makes culture really effective is that you're seeing it for the first time. Like I said, there's no way our generation is ever going to understand what it was like to see Led Zeppelin for the first time. To never, ever seeing a heavy metal band and then suddenly have someone come on stage and play Black Dog and Jimmy Page and Robert Plant's combo just completely flooring you. That enthralled the baby boomers to an extent that we can hardly even imagine when we grow up with this stuff in TV commercials. And the same thing is true. I hate to say this about myself, but it takes such a long time to unlearn this stuff when you encounter it in a sterilized form. I remember hearing the Fifth Symphony for the first time, and the only thing I could think of was, oh wow, so that's the thing I've been hearing in parodies of itself. Yeah, dun, 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 dun. You heard that whole famous intro parodied so many times that by the time you hear the actual thing, you're like, oh, of course, it's that thing that people play all the time in television commercials and in little jingles. And the Ode to Joy is the same way. I mean, like my keychain plays the Ode to Joy. The elevator plays it. It was in Macy's the other day in jazz form. And so the actual thing can't seize control of you the same way. And by the time the new generation actually gets around to reading Lord of the Rings, if they ever do, they're going to blow right through it, and it's going to have very little gravity for them, because for them it's just a slower, more plodding way of feeding them the same characters that are on their lunch boxes and that are plastered all over video games, and their ability to understand what it really means is kind of lost. And I think it might be intended to be lost. I think that this might be, in some nefarious way, I think people might understand what they're actually doing. They're sealing up the portals that could lead to scary places, and they're assuring people that there's something beyond these points that they really need to look into. And it's hard to know what really comes after it, I should say. The solution, the best solution that, because to go to my original query, I should say, before I kind of finish this off, to go to my original query, it's really hard to think of pieces of fiction or movies that you could see that really took possession of you and that you think are going to be a part of your life. Even things that are competently made, like Dune or The Northman, are fundamentally hollow because the people don't really believe in them. They don't really believe in the message they're speaking. And so it's hard to know what you can do to kind of create post-woke culture. The most compelling idea is just to kind of go back and to reach deeper. For instance, the obvious inspiration for Lord of the Rings is Wagner's The Ring Cycle. This is a delightful piece of fiction. It's an opera in 3 parts. And I don't know, I'd recommend seeing it. I'd never seen it myself. Largely because opera is so insanely expensive. I remember it premiering at the Seattle Opera, and like the tickets were thousands of dollars. It was insane. And obviously can't afford that on a grad student budget, so it was out of the question. But I can't afford that on anybody's budget that's not filthy rich. But they can't touch that anymore. The reason they can't touch the Ring Cycle because they can't possibly rectify its many problematic elements. It's too far away from them. It's out of scope. It's like taking Lovecraft. Well, it's actually worse than trying to wokeify Lovecraft. They've tried to do that with a lot less success. But the ring cycle is too old, and it doesn't translate well enough into our time, and it's too politically incorrect, and it's too tightly connected to mid-century Germans for them to properly be able to process this as an entertainment product in their system. So one solution, I think, to woke culture is to kind of go back and reach for that. To reach for basic things that are out of reach, either because they're too complicated or they operate in a non-PC world that they can't really conceptualize very easily, and to do stuff with that and to work with that and to become comfortable with that, and to hope that that's sort of a generative basis for something new. The other thing is, and I think that's a necessary step, and the other thing is to create your own stuff. But this is kind of difficult, because I think that we don't really live in a world that's conducive to creating long-form pieces of culture. I think people don't... I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm not saying that if you have the great American novel on your computer, you shouldn't publish it, or that you shouldn't try to get it out to the world, because God knows, I would readily read a good novel written by a reactionary author, and I'm really starved for new stuff that really tries to communicate with the state of our world. But for whatever reason, I don't know if we've culturally mastered that yet. I don't think that it took a long time for the novel to come about as something that was really meaningful in our civilization. You go back to ancient Greek poets, and they're very long-winded. You go to medieval songs, and they're much shorter. They're much more sparse. I mean, I'm not including things like Canterbury Tales or the Song of Roland or whatever, epic poetry. But it seems, I think, that in certain areas of time, the simple forms have to be mastered before the more complex forms can. The shorter pieces and the more basic pieces have to be explored before they can be built into something that's more meaningful. Whenever you deal with a novel, or whenever you deal with a piece of theater like Shakespeare, you're standing on top of a huge sea of cultural references and tropes that you all have in common, and references to the real world. But I think we kind of have that, but what's being accomplished right now is that our culture is becoming deracinated. We're unlearning the deep connections, the deep illusions that these things have. Sandman was really meaningful because I understood what Rudyard Kipling meant. I understood what Canterbury Tales meant. I understood what the Arabian Nights meant and what Shakespeare meant. And the people who I didn't know, I discovered through it, like Aleister Crowley and G.K. Chesterton, in very, very different ways. And I could piece together from that the deep threads of meaning that Neil Gaiman was alluding to. He was alluding to his emotional effect when he read these deeper authors. The people who read Sandman now as part of a Sandman fan community are not going to get that, and they're going to be encouraged not to get that. They're going to be pointed away from those directions, because that's the exact opposite direction that modern pop culture wants you to go. And as such, the postmodern form, the postmodern magnum omnibus like Sandman, where everything is just one gigantic hill of references, one after the other, that's going to kind of collapse in on itself. And what's going to replace that are smaller forms of culture that just focus on a single thing that we can all feel. The first and most primordial bacterial elements of these small pieces of culture are memes, which is the modern version of graffiti. But I would like to think that from graffiti, we can move to doggerel. From doggerel, we can move to plain verse and poetry. From weird pictures, we can move to symbolic art and maybe not banners, because that involves a political dimension, but to archetypical depictions of things that we all know to be the underlying reality of what's going on. Symbolic paintings. Think of the Chinese paintings of the late Ming Dynasty, or the art that comes out of the Tokugawa era. Art that was so constrained by political formalism that you couldn't depict anything that wasn't approved by the censors. And as a result, the artists came up with their own mimetic language, such that there's an interplay between what's being depicted and what's being communicated. And that was enough for the culture to survive. That was enough, I hope, well, really for the sake of the Chinese more than my own culture in this example, that was enough to carry forward the rich pieces of culture that were trying to be suppressed by a political orthodoxy that was afraid of them. Maybe I'm wrong about this. Maybe we should be thinking bigger. But I'm thinking for myself, the way that poetry has become more meaningful recently, and the way that short stories have become more meaningful recently, that's the wrong way to think. That the way to think is, okay, I need to master the small. I need to go back to the basics. Because the smallness is really what requires it to be so thoroughly connected to the real world. Now, you can write fantasy epics that never touch grass, that are completely meta. They're completely, and fanfics have this quality a lot, right? You can write reams and reams and reams and reams and reams of fan fiction, and it can all be self-serving, and it can all be kind of like this video game logic, where everything is a representation of a representation, and your main character is a self-insert character that has no flaws, and your fantasy world has 1,000 different races and 10,000 banners and a bunch of different political alliances, but none of the physics of any of those nations feel like you could they're actually countries you could go to, or actual cultures that you could visit. What made Tolkien's fantasy good is that you could imagine yourself walking into Hobbiton or Rivendell and actually having an experience there. Whereas you really can't with a lot of stuff that comes out of modern fiction. You really can't, because it's all sort of a Potemkin village for a certain kind of story that has a certain kind of narcissistic and self-gratifying end. But narcissism, the poem, the small picture, the vignette, they're too small to be narcissistic. They're too small for your own ego, and they're too small for your stupid political messages. They're too basic for that. Just tell me what you're feeling in this moment. Tell me what you're afraid of when you look out the door and see your community and what's happened to it in the last 3 years. Tell me what you want for the future, and don't tell me in words like Greta Thunberg, buzzwords. Tell me in what you want to see actually exist among human communities, among people that are actually going to draw breath, among people who are actually going to run around an area and get tired and sweat. That's what people want. And that's what people want to hear. That's what people want, obviously. In the current age, people want nothing but politics and narcissism, but that's what people need to hear. And that's what I'm kind of dying to hear, because, frankly, I feel like I'm suffering from cultural malnutrition. So, again, considering this is a very ill-prepared talk, I'll kind of open the floor and let people give their own opinions on this before I start doing the super chats. But with that, I hope you guys enjoyed the talk, and we'll move on to super chats and questions and answers, I guess. I could talk about politics again, but I was kind of tired of that. The politics, it's sort of depressing in its repetition. They're not even really trying anymore. I think this week they declared all people who support MAGA to be semi-fascists and enemies of the state. And of course, could they justify any of this? No. Are they accusing people of being traitors for things they themselves have said under different administrations? Yes. Is anyone in this audience surprised about that? No. We're all just kind of waiting for this to play out. We're all kind of waiting for the other foot to drop. We're all kind of waiting for some kind of thing to change on the ground, and we have to put up with the bullshit in the meantime. We have to kind of roll our eyes through all of this. We have to kind of pretend like they're not trying to bait us into action, and that they're not trying to actively gaslight us in this entire process. So I don't know. Is there what is there interesting to talk about in politics? What's interesting, the thing that I am hard to make videos about this, right? What's interesting to me is what post-COVID America actually looks like on the ground. Here in New Jersey, it looks like a complete mess of people who don't trust each other anymore. And I think it's more or less the same way. And we have to start somewhere. So with that, I'm going to start in on the super chats, and maybe this will be a shorter stream tonight. Again, never able to stop this. I got to work on my production values. But anyway, guys, the entropy chat is in the description. And how am I doing on time? I'm an hour in on this whole process, so maybe I'll spend a little bit more time on the super chats. Hopefully I've got some good open-ended ones this time, and we'll see what we can do. Okay, Creeper Weirdo for $10 USA. Regarding the Lord of the Rings fiasco, I've seen an interesting conversation emerge. One side says no hate watching because the work can use that against you. The other side says we need to control the narrative so that when people think of the work, they can think the way we want to. Thoughts? Well, I mean, hate watching it. I mean, if you're going to make a review of Lord of the Rings, if you're going to create media that literary criticism is always valuable. And I'm not saying this, I always get the name of this movie wrong because I love this quote. I can't remember, I think it's Metropolitan actually by Whit Stillman. I think I called it Cosmopolitan the last time I mentioned it. But Metropolitan by Whit Stillman, where the character says, literary criticism is always good because it tells you not only what happened in the book, but what to think about it. And so it saves you time. And so literary criticism is always good. If you want to write a review of Amazon's Lord of the Rings or Rings of Power or whatever, I guess you'll have to watch it. I'm not going to watch your review because there's no point in me watching it. Or I know what this is. I know what they're trying to do. I know how they're trying to sell it. I've seen this movie before so many times, and furthermore, I know how they betrayed the original source material. In fact, I've kind of given a talk on it for the last 40 minutes. It's bait. Right. And I don't think that by writing a review, you're chomping on the bait. By getting visibly angry, you're chomping on the bait. That's what you have to do. It's very important not to get angry at this stuff. It's very important to understand that it's trying to make you angry. This Lord of the Rings series was designed so that you get really angry at it. And then Matt Yglesias and Noah Smith could go, oh, why are you so angry about the race swaps? Why are you so angry? We're angry because we don't live in a colorblind society, and we don't live in a world that has no ethnicities. And human beings are not a parade of cultures, and people and ethnicities are not interchangeable. And to pretend like this is some representation of what Tolkien thought is an absolute insult. And kind of... And I don't know, who hasn't heard this? Who needs to hear this? I don't know. Apparently some people need to hear this. But I don't know. I mean, the question, I guess, is who's going to be the audience for... people right now, I guess... This is sort of a question I have. There are new generations of people, I suppose, who've come through the institutions and who have never seen genuine criticism of woke material. My sense was that since 2014, these types of pushbacks have been ubiquitous. And we're getting to the point where most people who are reasonably aware of media are going to be able to to recite the stuff from rote memory. But again, there could always be new generations who need to hear these arguments one more time. I can't bring myself to be really engaged with it because I already know what's being talked about. I guess on a second order level, what needs to be understood more is the trope of the call out. It's the fact that not only is the woke up as diverse casting cliche, the response to diverse castings backlash is also a cliche. We can see that these responses to the backlash against the new Lord of the Rings have been pre-written. It's obvious they are, and so in some sense that sort of second order reaction is more important than the actual denouncement of the text itself. So I mean, there's that. Okay, Kian Kurji. Kian Kurji for $3 USA. Other than Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones prequel is also out. It is actually good. Is it that George Martin can't finish the books because of what you said earlier? Or is it that the story is too complex? Well, you're saying that this prequel to Game of Thrones is actually good? Well, that's actually not very surprising, actually. I mean, I'm going to kind of rehash my take on Game of Thrones and why it was a modern phenomenon. It's way easier to sell a Game of Thrones-like story to modern audiences than Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, I mean, just, if I were a modern movie producer and I was going to, not my movie producer is bad because the movie producer only cares about butts and seats. If I were a director, like an auteur, or a screenwriter, and I really wanted to make a name for myself as a writer, and I still had to deal with like PC constraints and all that stuff. I'll try to ignore them, but I'll do whatever. I'll sign the dotted line. I'll accept the diverse casting. I'll include asides to sort of woke ideology. I would direct the Game of Thrones or write for Game of Thrones in an instant before I would do the Lord of the Rings stuff, because Lord of the Rings is a dying form because the soul's torn out of it. There's no there. No one's going to care about this stuff. I mean, people like my son's generation is going to look at Lord of the Rings if they haven't read the book the same way that the boomers looked at John Wayne movies or Flash Gordon, or the same way that maybe my generation looked at something like Rambo, or some sort of quaint piece of pop culture that's well past its expiration date, and that's designed for a world that no longer exists. Rambo's a good example that comes to mind because it's like this Cold War Vietnam war era hero that I remember seeing pictures of Rambo and thinking, that is just such what is the relevance of this character? It's such a boomer hero, right? Like, he fought in Vietnam and went back and won the war. What is this supposed to mean to me, being this 90s kid, right? But that digression aside, Lord of the Rings is obviously dying because it presupposes this belief in spirituality and in magic and in folkways and in deep ethnicities and in deep lore that guides those ethnicities. You have to understand that to really tap into the spirit, and deep connection to the land also. I mean, increasingly few people are feeling that. That's the emotional core of Lord of the Rings, and what these more recent iterations of Lord of the Rings have done is they've severed the symbols, the characters, and the tropes from the emotional core that gave it its spirit. And so what it's like a body part that's been separated from the circulatory system. It's moribund. It's going to die. The same is not true for Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is always going to feel vital because the beating heart of Game of Thrones is Machiavellian power politics, and Machiavellian power politics, far from becoming less relevant, are going to become more relevant. They're going to become more relevant because what's the whole point of Game of Thrones? What made it feel so viscerally accurate when it was the hottest thing on television 10 years ago? What made it feel so viscerally accurate is that everyone then had a visceral instinct that has happened now, was going to happen. And that was that all our pretensions about systems of government were going to collapse into primordial politics, into Smithian politics, largely organized around this friend-enemy distinction. Largely organized not around principle, but around loyalty, which is how medieval politics work. Who are you loyal to? That's the question that people in Game of Thrones asked, not who are you, what systems, what do you think is the most effective way to tax Westeros? And what's the most effective altruistic way to run Westeros so that the GDP of this medieval economy can be optimized? That's not the question characters ask themselves in Game of Thrones, even if they're interested in good governance. It's, are you loyal to a good king? Are you for chaos or for order? Are your religious principles sound, or are they blasphemous? Are you a traitor, or are you a saint? That's the language that makes sense in Westeros and in Game of Thrones, and that language is direct. It connects to our understanding mythopoetics. That background's essential. But what generates the emotions around it aren't a specific poetic or folkway that it leads into it, as in something like the Ring Cycle or Tolkien. Rather, it's just the realities of living in a world where people are constantly backstabbing each other, and where you need to know who you can trust or not. The difficulty in what ultimately is going to capsize both House of Dragons or whatever, and it did capsize Game of Thrones, is eventually people are ask, oh, well, so how does the story end? How does the story end? What ultimately is a satisfying ending for a person viewing Machiavellian power politics? Well, the story ends... the story ends with a king coming to... The story ends either with absolute apocalypse. The kingdom is destroyed. It ends like King Lear. Not only does everyone die, the few surviving characters, far from providing hope, intimate that this is the end of all order, that some apocalypse has been reached, and what's going to happen is a complete reset. The kingdom is completely destroyed. The White Walkers overrun Westeros, and the Night King sits on the Iron Throne. That's one way it ends. The other way it ends is with a good king coming to power, or alternatively, with tragedy. The king dies, but with an illusion that in the tragic death, order has been restored. Somewhat the way that something like Hamlet ends. I guess Hamlet's a little bit more pessimistic. Maybe Macbeth would be a better example, right? Macbeth dies, but there's this understanding that order has been restored. The blasphemy that he perpetrated has been washed away from the kingdom by the death of the tyrant, and now order can resume. The problem is that modern audiences are not led to believe that some kind of cathartic renewal is possible, and they're not led to... They can't believe this because... they can't believe that the modern order is something worth believing in, because it's manifestly not. And we're discouraged from all of our educational institutions from believing that some kind of medieval political order, some kind of more basic political order in the form of a monarchy, in the form of unironic religious regulation, or an unironic religious saint, we're discouraged from believing that they ever could be possible. We can't imagine a Catherine of Siena bringing political order, bringing concordance to an otherwise war-torn Italy. We can't believe that there might be a King Louis who could be a just king. We can't believe that there might be a Constantine or a restoration of a political order that is not something that exists to be cynically raged against, but exists such that all good people can bend a knee to it and feel secure in the understanding that it provides a promise for the future of their children and their children's children after them. We don't believe in this because our educational institutions are incentivized not to allow us to believe in something like this happening. Because if we can't believe in something like this happening, it opens up a scary door. It opens up a scary door into a much deeper reality, into a much more meaningful reality that would also undermine the very principles that the modern social order relies on being denied. And because of that, there can be no cathartic ending to Game of Thrones or to any world that exists in Game of Thrones. It's going to be people politically backstabbing each other again and again and again and again and again. And there's not going to be any kind of cathartic ending that's believable any more than there can be a cathartic ending to the Real Housewives of Miami or whatever those drama shows are that people watch. So hopefully that answers the question, Creeper Weirdo. I'm going to go on to the next one. Oh, I'm sorry. That was Hyun Kurji. But thank you very much. I'm going to go on to the next super chat. Antimatter Bone Crusher for $10 USA. I watched the Elvis biopic. It's what you'd expect. A complete cavalcade of leftist memes. True masculinity lies in androgyny and femininity. True whiteness rests in black music. True evil rests in Nazism. And true salvation rests in social depravity and degeneracy. How is the left not bored with this stuff? That is the best question I have ever. You might have stumped me there. I've been asking myself this for 2 years now. How is the left not bored with this stuff? When you look at Elvis, I mean, Elvis is a great example of something. I was talking about in the previous question about pop culture that seemed immediately irrelevant by the time that I heard it for the first time. Elvis is the perfect example of that. I heard Led Zeppelin for the first time, and maybe I'd heard it once or twice on a radio commercial or something like that. But I experienced it in somewhat the same way my parents did, as rock and roll music. But by the time I popped an actual Elvis album unironically into my Discman and listened to it, I'd heard these songs parodied more times than I'd heard them sung genuinely. And I was more familiar with Elvis jokes than I was familiar with the actual image of Elvis performing in real life. I had no idea of what it might mean to see in the late 40s a young Elvis perform for the very first time. And that sort of raw masculine charm he has was, I never really thought about what it might mean to somebody because I only ever experienced it as kind of a cultural joke. But Elvis is just he did have this kind of raw masculine magnetism to it. And so it's amazing that, not amazing, this is coming, but it's I can't imagine he'd be, I can't imagine, but it seems like it would hard to make him, it's really hard to make Elvis, in my opinion, an advertisement for degeneracy and kind of effeminate lifestyle, because it seemed like he was the closest to life when he was embodying what it meant to be masculine and in control. And when he kind of gave in to indulgence and showmanship and drug use and degeneracy, I mean, that's what eventually killed him. And so it's almost the opposite story, right? The true story of Elvis is the person who discovered vitalism in America of the post-war, and then eventually saw vitalism transform into degeneracy, very tragically, in many ways, by forces he himself unleashed. And there's sort of a tragic dimension to that. And that's interesting and would be interesting to explore in the form of a movie. I can't imagine it would be interesting to be lied to about all this stuff, right? I mean, the one true thing about the story of Elvis is just that he was channeling a certain vitalism of the African American community. That's one of the great ironies in all of this woke stuff, is that for all of the for every lie we hear about an African American contribution that never was, the ones that actually were genuine seem less real. And certainly you cannot tell the story of rock and roll music without telling the story of the African American community in the 20th century. And so that you know, that connection is sort of undeniable. And but the question of how the left does not get bored with this stuff, in some sense it looks like they are bored with it. When I watch them, and I don't watch them very much anymore, all I see is people kind of going through the numbers and repeating the same thing over and over again and getting supremely bored with where they are. I want to, if I get onto a live stream with leftists ever again, and I've really been trying to, that's the first question I want to ask them is, how are you guys not bored with this stuff? This is leading absolutely nowhere. There's no life to this. One thing you learn as a new parent is certain things about boredom. Kids aren't boring. This is, I mean, they're kind of, in some sense, they kind of, they're tiring. They're tiring because they keep your brain in low gear. And it's hard to explain this to somebody who doesn't have kids. But if you were to, your brain gets tired for not being stimulated by things that are really engaging and challenging. And if you are with kids too long, then you develop a certain fatigue in that way. But it doesn't strike you as boredom, right? So today after work, I ran around the table endlessly singing Baby Shark with my son, because that's all he wants to sing again and again and again. 2 verses. And it wasn't boring. It felt like it was the most vital part of my entire day. My brain certainly wasn't satisfied with it. It wasn't intellectually stimulating, but it wasn't boring. Pretending like Biden's speech is good governance, that's boring. Not only is it unintellectually stimulating, it's transparent that what you're doing isn't vital. Like, there's another thing that can never be boring is taking a walk. For all those people who are looking for the first step to kind of feeling more alive and to being an artist, you can take Nietzsche's advice, which is blasphemous advice, that the one true crime against the Holy Spirit is indolence, and take a walk. Your best thoughts come to you when you're walking around, and not on a treadmill, in the real world, I mean. Your best thoughts come to you when you're moving around the real world. And even if you live in a strip mall urban wasteland, you're going to become familiar with the grotesque beauty of that place, walking around it in real time. Jogging can never be boring for the same reason. Again, your brain will get kind of understimulated if you do it too much, although your body gets tired first, right? But it's never boring, right? Like no one gets tired of jogging because you're engaged in this vitalistic activity. And the same thing is true when you have a family. Like, your brain's understimulated, but it's never boring because you're participating in the process of actually living. When you're pretending like these woke rehashes are real, not only are you not doing anything intellectually stimulating, you're actively participating in the process of cultural death, of painting over the interesting, of sanitizing things, of sterilizing things, of making the living the slaves to the dead. And of burying us under restrictions. That's gotta be stifling. That's gotta be stifling for these people. And I don't know how these people pretend to actually be interested in what they're doing. I need to check in on some of the BreadTube people. I mean, obviously ContraPoints doesn't make videos anymore, but those other characters, like H. Bomber guy, like, what does he talk about? I mean, they briefly save themselves from irrelevance by pretending all to be communists. But all of those communist LARPers probably got to be taking a step back now, because it's a lot harder to pretend like you're Che Guevara now that your pay pigs no longer want you to smash the state. I'm sorry, Antimenta Bro Crusher. That question is just flat out too hard for me. Why aren't... I mean, they've got to be bored. This is like the existence of a magnetic monopole. If I were to look inside leftists' brains, and I were to see definitively and unquestioningly that they were not bored, but were supremely engaged with what they were doing, I think I'd have to seriously reconsider my entire intellectual model for the reality of human nature. I'd have to convince myself that leftism is not what I think it is, as sort of like the pseudo religion that promises things that it can't deliver. Or I'd have to believe that there are literally like two kinds of humans, and that the leftists are some kind of human that can be satisfied with the supremely unsatisfying approach to the world and to real life and to what's actually valuable in real life. I don't know. That would be fascinating to actually understand if that was true. Okay, Ben White for his always interesting post. Why did that not go up? Let's try that again. Okay. Ben White for $3. Well, we get the weekly relationship update. The date this weekend didn't go well. A little too loose for me. But I guess that's par for the course for most Gen Z girls. She was homeschooled for 11 to 12 years too. Can anyone escape from the GAE? Yeah, I mean, this is the problem with women in particular. I mean, guys will never understand this. This is something that Kofifi Annan said in his talk with Alex Kashuda. The podcast, by the way, I thoroughly recommend. You guys should all watch it. But us men will never know just the kind of hit you get as a reasonably attractive woman in her mid-20s. You know, where you kind of jumped out of the nest and can navigate the dating world. And because the amount of attention you get is out of this world. It's like nothing. I mean, maybe if you are a very, very attractive man who's very, very self-confident, and for that reason, you know, probably can make his own luck, and, you know, life feels very different to you anyway than most people, because you're in like the top 99th percentile of performance. With the exception of potentially those men, that's an experience that very few male people will have. And so a lot of times when young girls come in contact with that drug, it's just irresistible. It's just, they can't help but kind of play along with it, at least a little bit, because the culture is telling them everything that they want to hear. And how could you not believe? I mean, I guess I can blame them, because it's stupid and it's short-sighted and you're going along with the lie. But when I was 20 years old, I gave into all sorts of stuff that I knew was self-destructive. And it was much less enticing than what a lot of these young women have right in front of them. So, I don't know. You know, loose 20-year-old women are certainly not worth... I mean, they're not worth trying to seek long-term relationships with. It's just move on. Find a more serious girl. You know, but... And the more serious girls do definitely exist, even though they're definitely rarer than they used to be. I'm hoping very devoutly that the dating app economy just is completely obliterated. I don't know how this eschaton could come about, but it's got to happen, because this total destruction of our ability to actually pair off has been driven by this, and it's been driven way too long by this. But another super chat, Keon Kurji for $3 USA. Hi, Dave. This is off topic, but I would like your opinion on Coach Red Pill. I unsubscribed to his Patreon after I started to get con man vibes. Do you agree, or am I being paranoid? Well, okay, I'll let you in a little secret here. Like, Coach Red Pill has. I'll make private communications public. Who cares? This is not like. I'm not revealing anything about him, but con man might be a little bit. He's definitely an opportunist. I mean, does anyone not know that he's this opportunist? He chases clout wherever he can get it, and he always goes to what's popular rather than what's interesting. And furthermore, he sells young men on the promises of being like this Chad operator who will be able to get all the women and discover what masculinity is. And oh, I'm so smart. I'm this total operator. I'm this entrepreneur who has all this money and who's dating all these younger women and blah 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 blah. That's the image he likes to project. Early on, Coach Red Pill and Endeavor and I were all kind of. I don't really know who invited Coach Red Pill, but we're all kind of in the same community of 2018 era right-wing YouTubers who were in kind of the internet blood sports scene a little bit on the margins, and a variety of people, myself included, didn't like Coach Red Pill very much stylistically. But there's a general agreement that we wouldn't call him out. We just want to let sleeping dogs lie, and he seemed like an asset. As time has gone on, Coach Red Pill has basically picked a fight for really no reason whatsoever with every single one of my friends, and has totally exploded on them and has created drama and disowned them. For myself, he asked me to do a research project for him shortly after my son was born. And when I informed him that I was a new father and I didn't have the bandwidth to do like a documented research project on what he wanted me to do for no money whatsoever, he exploded at me, called me a spurg and a loser, and like went on this extended rant about how he was so great and I was a loser and blah 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 blah. Completely unhinged from the reality of the situation, and people will have similar stories. I don't know. In my experience, people like this aren't really worth hanging out with. I don't know. He'll always be on the front line of things because he actively seeks out controversy and seeks to make himself a part of that controversy. I don't know what he's doing in Ukraine. For a while, people thought he was dead, but it's. What are you looking for? Are you looking for, if you're reading Coach Red Pill because you want someone to kind of jump into whatever the most recent controversy is and be present for that, then I guess you're getting what you want. If you're looking for an honest actor who's looking for the truth and that's doing something beyond just self-promotion, you're certainly not getting that with Coach Red Pill. So, judge accordingly. He's certainly not as good a writer as someone like Hunter S. Thompson, who was the previous person who jumped in with both feet into the active areas of relevance in his own time. And he's certainly not as interesting either. So, I don't know. Make your decision accordingly. Glow in the Dark. Glow in the Dark says, imagine having to agree with everything someone famous said, or some fandom community said. The woke claim everything as theirs. If it isn't with them, it needs to be banned. Yeah, this is the phenomenon people call the egregore. And I think this is what social media has created in the fan community. I really should have, if I had more time to put this talk together in my mind, I probably would have started this way. But there's sort of a line between myself as a 90s kid picking up Sandman for the first time, thinking it's so important that graphic novels be considered by important people in this world as being important pieces of media. Like, it's just so important for my personal identity as like this teenager. There's a connection between that and what fan communities have become in 2022 as this insane vitriolic maelstrom of narcissism and recrimination and groupthink. And it's very connected to what the transgender community has become as well. It seems to me what happens is, okay, well what makes a fan community important? Well, and what makes the ideas of a piece of media important? Well, it's that a lot of people all agree that it's important. And it's important, obviously, that this community stay on message and have coherence and saliency, and that they have a political message, right? Because politics always makes you important, because politics is by definition unignorable. So what you saw in Prefiguration in the early 2000s, and what you see in Completion post Tumblr in 2022, is the creation of the egregore. It's the intellectual equivalent of the bubble market. As long as people are buying in, the hive mind is 100% confident because its own validation is fueling it. But skepticism and crimes against the groupthink, crimes against the fan community, and the politics that fan community is supposed to have, best represented in the form of a woke author like Neil Gaiman himself, that's verboten. Furthermore, is any analysis or thought patterns that might cut against what the fan community wants to think. The fan community wants to think that Sandman is important. It doesn't want to think, hey, what if the real G.K. Chesterton had some good ideas that we should follow? Because it seems in the moment that those two things are, well, I guess they weren't, they're not as part of the text necessary, but in the moment it seems like they're completely incompatible, because ideologically Neil Gaiman and Chesterton are definitively at odds. You can't reconcile those two people's worldviews. One is a woke proponent of everything modern, narcissistic, and atomized, and the other one was a deep defender of folkways and true religion, and the understanding of community based around the family. I don't know, those are detached. But the egregore thrives on what the fan community is, not what the deeper text might point to. In some sense, in spite of myself, I would have to say it's almost it's a much more Catholic perspective than it is a Protestant one. In this form of it, right? In this form of it, it seems that it's like, oh, the church has decided that this is what we all believe, so this is what we get to believe. And you know, obviously, I believe that the church actually is following the scripture, but the Protestant idea that an individual would follow the text in ways that contradict the institution itself is anathema to how this thing thinks and how it's come to behave. And you see this kind of carried over in extremum in the transgender community or the neopronouns community. As long as everyone agrees on a neopronoun, then that neopronoun is sacred. But the second that people think it's ridiculous, it immediately falls from grace. There's no external referent that pronoun or gender identity has. If people agree it's a legitimate gender identity, then it is a civil rights category and it becomes sacred. If not enough people sign on to it, it's literally a joke. And there's no external differentiation between the two of those things that has any meaningful distinction. Okay, moving on from Glow in the Dark to Trey 50 Daniel. Trey says, "Hey Dave, I have recently subscribed to the truth that everything is political. As the left says, having recognized that anything that has a vector of power spawns a pseudo-political game for power. I've experienced it many times in sports leagues and back in grade school clubs as such. Thoughts? Well, yeah, I mean, everything has a political dimension to it, but in order to be effective, the organization has to suppress that political dimension as much as possible, because the contest of power is going to undermine the thing itself. Your sports league, to use your example, your sports league is absolutely a political entity. But if you're a sports team or a sports league, my eyes aren't settling on it right now. If it gets absorbed by politics, you will ruin that. I mean, you know this, right? If your sports team focuses on political on who has the most power, or which groups are more represented, or what statement this sports team is going to make to the rest of the world regarding global warming, you're probably not going to do very well in whatever league you're competing in unless you have some insane advantage that comes from some external quality of your sports team. Maybe you got a real ringer. Maybe Daryl Strawberry, to pull out a 90s reference, maybe he's sitting in your dugout. But short of that, if you politicize the organization, you're going to destroy the organization. And this is, everyone knows this. So everything is political, but that's really like saying everything is corrupted. It's not exactly the same thing as saying everything is corrupted. But politics, in most circumstances, in all but the most controlled circumstances, politics is just a form of corruption in that organization, and it needs to be contained, or it will consume the thing in question. And the left operates on ignoring this. The left operates on having so much power and so much money that it will be able to just tank the corruption, let the corruption grow. Who cares? It will degrade the thing in question, but we'll just pour money on it until eventually, I guess, we run out of money and corruption consumes everything, which is kind of where we are now in a lot of institutions. And yeah, it's a wonderful ride. It's only going to get worse from here. Hopefully not to the point where we're actually experiencing Nicklandian zombie apocalypse, but you know, that's just my own vain hope for the future. Okay. Yeah, I think I answered that question, so I'll move on. Thank you very much. I am not so sure what more I can offer, but yeah, keep in mind, you know, when you embrace this, the personal is political. The personal is political. Friend-enemy distinction. Friend-enemy distinction. Keep in mind that this is a true statement, but what they're describing when they say that everything is political, Machiavellian politics is real, the political reality always wins. That's true, but they're describing a certain bad endpoint of reality. That's sort of like saying like everything dies. That is absolutely true. Everything dies. Entropy is real. The universe is slowly decaying. Reality is slowly decaying. Chaos always wins. But the second you give in to that, you are essentially becoming the agent of death, and the agents of the universe's own destruction, and the agent potentially of the destruction of your own soul. All goodness and all life is meant as an action to defy this fundamental force that is real, that we are pointing out. And I don't know what to tell you. You've got to find something in your life that's worth living for, some God, some love, some truth, some beauty that you can use as a guiding light, or failing that, some lie, right? Although those tend not to hold up for very long, right? Because the second you become a worshiper of the chaos that is the eventual fate of the universe, you're, in my mind, becoming an agent of evil. even if that evil is pointing to an evil that is a reality in the universe around us. It's not your job to become an agent of that reality. And I know that the distinction I'm pointing to, it's very strange. It toys with this weird, perverse dimension in our own minds as humans, where we can't really distinguish the reality of chaos and evil with the idea that we shouldn't make that God or worship it or follow it or give in to it. I don't know what to say to you. Well, I probably could think of something, but I can't think of something right off the top of my head. So we'll move on, right? Humanity has to relearn its own vitalism. And the core part of vitalism is to understand that death is real and that chaos is real and not give into it, right? I can't think of a better definition of vitalism than to acknowledge the reality of death and chaos and to neither give in to your self-obliteration nor the absolute gratification of your own will towards chaos. That's my best definition of vitalism that I can think of standing on one foot. Iron Duke for $5 USA. Tolkien was an English gentleman in the best sense of the word, a Christian, a World War I British soldier, and a professor of Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon literature. He was an expert on Beowulf, I believe. I never read his translation he wrote a translation of Beowulf, right? I read the Samus Henley translation, which was really good. I think it's a more modern one. It's the famous one that really got popular in like 2003 or something like that. I read it ages ago, but it's good. I read it at the same time I read Gardner's Grendel, and it's like a pretentious culture thing. Oh, I'm gonna read Beowulf, and then I'm gonna read the postmodern retelling of Beowulf Grendel. Both are excellent books, by the way. Highly recommended. But moving on. To continue, I should say, Iron Duke's quote. He wrote Lord of the Rings as high fantasy and myth for England and Britain, not the whole world. I mean, yeah, that's the whole point, right? The whole point of Lord of the Rings is that it's not general, it's particular. And furthermore, Tolkien's vision of the good world was a patchwork of particular places, not a homogenization of all places together, not a mixture of all colors into one big mismatched mismatch. And the idea that what's so ironic is that Tolkien literally calls this out in the form of Saruman, who, when Tolkien visits him in his corrupted form, he goes from wearing a white robe to a multicolored robe, and he talks about this very process of homogenization, of uniformization. Now, by that, Tolkien was really, I think, referencing the Industrial Revolution, or modernity, or what we could rightly call, I think, early modernity, which Tolkien saw as the ultimate gristmill, which ground to death English culture, probably starting with Oliver Cromwell, but certainly continuing on into the land clearances of the 18th century, and then on into the industrialization of the North in the 19th and 20th centuries of England, which I think Tolkien thought had cleared out an authentic village culture that had existed there for thousands of years. Not thousands of years, probably 2,000 or a little less than 2,000. Because or maybe you could argue it existed in Celtic or Roman times, but that's beyond the scope of this thing. The idea, when we see sort of, that's what Tolkien was raging against, the cultural destruction of early modernity. He was certainly raging against its new development in Sauron the White. He was certainly drawing a reference to the new forms it was taking in late modernity. in where we are now, where the Industrial Revolution has become globalization. And literally, the machine wants to make everything identically mixed little widgets where all peoples look exactly the same. And all cities have the same set of restaurants. They all have the same menu that's very, very big, but is uniform throughout. And everyone has the same culture, and everyone sings the same songs, and everyone speaks the same language, but no one really remembers their folk music. I mean, we read things like Sandman here, and we have things that make all sorts of little references to all the different cultures and all the different flavors, but they never lead anywhere. The strings are snipped. The pathways that go from the symbols to the wellspring of the spirituality and the deep reality that they referenced have all been blocked away and colored off, cordoned off, and you can't get to anything deeper. That's exactly what Tolkien was calling out in Lord of the Rings. That's exactly the vision of Saruman the White. That's exactly the world that Sauron wants to bring about, to prefigure his absolute domination of it, and the descent into chaotic singularity. That's the vision of Melkor and Morgoth that Tolkien alludes to in the Silmarillion. That is the self-devouring maw of the modern world. It couldn't be more explicit. But anyway, thanks for that super chat, and I don't see a question there, so I will move on. Glow in the Dark for $3 USA. These people just want to be a part of a fandom, and they should be called the bandwagon crowd or fan trenders. Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens to these people. I think that, I mean, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens, right? I would think that this has a limit to it, right? I would think that this has a limit. Like, you can't possibly get more meta, that people will eventually get bored. Certain examples from, this is what actually really depresses me about anime in particular, is that anime is, I'm not going to say it's like the singularity of pop culture, but it shows me that the place we are, it still can go down further into navel-gazing meta narratives. When you look at anime fan culture in Japan, it's this cute copy of a cute copy of a cute copy of a cute copy of a cute copy. It's so processed and refigured through plastic. The characters are so abstracted and then re-realized and then re-abstracted and re-realized. It's impossible to know what you're really looking at. An anime girl is not a representation of a girl. It's a representation now of an anime girl. You have, and when you look at otaku culture, you have men who are sexually reacting to anime girls, not as a symbol of what a real girl like this would look like, but as like an actual end state itself. And how can this go on indefinitely? Obviously not. Chaos devours itself. Cultural sterilization eventually becomes literally sterile. But we haven't hit rock bottom yet, not nearly in its entirety. And these little fan communities will exist as a kind of otaku culture, as long as we keep on feeding them resources. And I don't know, they'll probably be siloed off from the rest of us who want to actually live life in a world of physical bodies and real consequences. And humanity with all of its sweat and body hair and histories that are not homogenized and animals that aren't cute and nature that is hot and sticky and cold and brutal. But that's not, people will live their entire lives in this warmed over plastic illusion. Japan has taught us that. And maybe, I know not all cultures are in the theme of the show. Not all cultures are equal. Not all ethnicities are equal. Maybe the Japanese have a marginally higher capacity for boredom and satisfaction with this illusion. Even in the Japanese case, it's not indefinite, and they'll hit a wall with that as well. But Japan teaches me that we still have a lot farther to fall. And because of that, I'm not as optimistic that we can just dismiss this out of hand, unfortunately. Well, people are giving me a lot of super chats, which means I'm staying longer. Glow in the dark for $3 USA. There are dragons, so why does gravity work? There are dragons, so why do they have why don't they have laser guns? There are dragons, so why can't black people be hell? There are dragons, so why can't black people be hellspawn? Don't cancel me, Susan. Okay. Yeah, this is Richard Hanania. He laid this up. Richard Hanania is simultaneously really based and really Reddit tier cringed at the same time. His mind is literally a chimera between Bugman and GigaChat, as far as I'm concerned. What could we call him? Dr. Bugman and Mr. GigaChat. That's Richard Hanania, depending on what day you catch him, right? What side of the potion he's on. But in one of his true GigaChat moments, Hanania gave a layup where he posted a picture of all the Lord of the Rings characters in cars, like, oh well, they have dragons, so why can't Aragorn and Legolas drive into battle with 1967 Dodge Chargers, right? This is the same thing. I mean, this is the same thing they do for Warhammer too. Oh, the plot has to move on, right? The plot has to move on. Well, yeah, sure. The plot has to move on. Does that mean that technology has to get better too? If we're following this logic to its conclusion, well, you're going to destroy your fantasy very, very quickly. And this is, again, I mean, they know. If this were an actual dialogue with the creators, and we could have an actual conversation with people on the left or people who produce this stuff, you could demonstrate this to them very quickly if everything was open. You could show them that the reason why this has power is because it's alluding to a particular time and place, and that some rules bend easier than others. And the rules that don't bend are the ones that directly symbolize the reality that is in the reality of our past that we're trying to reconnect to and rediscover and revivify in our modern age, so that we can, and I want to emphasize this, so that we can in our own real lives find something that is more real. That's the whole reason why we're doing this. That's the whole reason why we're engaging with fiction, is so that at some point we can pull a thread and we can find something that actually exists in our own world that is fantastic, that is amazing. And if there isn't that connection with the past, then there isn't that connection with the real. Fantasy connects through the past, so when we sever the things that link us to the past, the real past it's alluding to, we destroy the fantasy itself. In the same, you can't have diversified villages in the same way that you can't have machine guns in the Battle of Helm's Deep. And that's the reality. Yeah, so good point here. I'm not so sure what about the Hellspawn, but I'm going to respect for keeping my YouTube channel sidestep around that super chat. So here we go. Neil, so Nerve AMV Maker for $10. Neil Gaiman neuters the strange in his work. I think it's because he got his supernaturalism from books. He thinks it's fake, which makes it safe. His inspirations believed in it and were inspired by reality. Machen from Celtic Christianity and Blackwood from nature. Their fiction feels anything but safe. Well, yeah, I totally agree with you there. But well, kind of. I mean, I wouldn't have liked Sandman if Neil Gaiman hadn't. Again, like I said, like it gets in the early part of Sandman, it feels like Neil Gaiman is just doing a bunch of references to different works and different historical periods that he doesn't really believe in or take seriously. It only really gets good when Neil Gaiman implies that the old stuff might actually be real and the new stuff actually be fake. Like I said, the best character in the series is is Thessaly, or the Thessalian, the primitivist feminist witch who looks like a feminist but is actually a psychotic blood cult worshiper who exists only for friend-enemy revenge-based politics, and whose feminism is completely a ruse. And that you would encounter things like that would imply that Neil Gaiman was actually connected to the real myth, but it turns out he forgot it. He understood it. He used it, but he didn't understand it. And his career encouraged him to emphasize and write about the things that were the least interesting things about what made his early work interesting. I guess that's the fate of us all. We all have limited energy, and sooner or later, the routine becomes more interesting than picking at the scab. But, we're only really human when we're picking at the scab. Because we're only really human when we're hurting. When we're trying to actually come to terms with something that we don't really understand. Curtis Yarvin I was on Benjamin Boyce's channel a few days ago, and he reminded me of a piece of wisdom that Yarvin said, and it's absolutely true. The woke era is going to lead to stronger and stronger reactionaries, because we have to deal with the fact that all of the ways that we can kind of be subconsciously conservative and preserve our traditions have just been taken away from us. So anything that we gravitate towards is going to have to be intentional, and it's going to have to be kind of juicy. The fact that Tolkien fans who don't want to deal with woke Lord of the Rings might have to reach for Wagner to get what really enthralled them about the original Lord of the Rings trilogy in a fresh way. That leads them down a path of relevance that's more fruitful than the Lord of the Rings fan from the 1980s, who would just, he was surrounded by people who took Lord of the Rings seriously, and he kind of got directed down the Dungeons and Dragons route, the superficial element of the whole thing. So, thank you very much, Nervaean V-Maker. I'm going to move on. I really need to have a division between the super chats and the monologue, so that if anyone just wants to hear the podcast or the monologue, they can log off afterwards. So, at any rate, let's just keep on going. Glow in the Dark for $3. If it is European fantasy, it should feel like European fantasy and not some Californian HR department. Well, certainly. They want to get rid of all separation they want to get rid of all separation or classification that can be exclusionary to their ideals. In particular, what ruins their ability to manage it on a global scale and to make it into a product that can be marketed with the least amount of offense to people, to an increasingly stringent number of regulations on what's acceptable to say and express. Believe me, in 10 years' time, if your fantasy world does not contain neo-pronouns, it's not going to be legitimate. So expect to see a bunch of transgender people wandering around your pre-modern society and obtaining gender affirming care at their local apothecary, right? Hark, an apothecary, please pass me some HRT, sir. My gender dysphoria has overcome me on my road to slay the dragon. You can imagine all sorts of renditions of that, right? And of course, the explanation of history itself will kind of become impossible to touch sooner rather than later, the way we're going right now. Ben White for $5 USA. Sometimes I wish that the world would just slow down. Every 8 years, even 8 years ago, I could be actual friends with people of differing political ideologies. Now I'm just afraid of being canceled. I know this is just wishful thinking. The country I grew up in is dead. Yes, the country we grew up in, is it dead? It's in the process of dying. And there's probably no bringing it back. Like I said, you kind of want to just slide into a comfortable existence after a while, don't you? But there's no way to do that and still maintain your soul. Because it's not, I think leftists, a lot of them, maybe they don't believe this anymore. Maybe they're just in a pure mode of sadism, for all I know, for all I can understand. They're in a mode of pure sadism. But for a while, I'm sure, they believed that there is just this, we all have this instinct of culture shock within us, right? It triggers at inopportune times when we see things that we're not familiar with or we're not comfortable with. It can be triggered in people if you. And this might be not a very Susan-friendly example, but I'll bring it up anyway. If you take someone from a non-homogenous society and a very homogenous society, and you bring them into a highly diverse society or a highly mixed society, they'll do a visible double take when they see like an interracial relationship for the first time or for the first several times. And you'll see this, you'll see the reaction. This is a well-known human reaction. It's this little thing like that, right? This is a reaction that we all have to seeing the unfamiliar and what we're not used to accommodating into our understanding of how the world works. And progressives think that this is why we're reacting to Lord of the Rings, is that the reason why we're angry at this is that it's just, we're so unused to seeing diverse casting. This is the first time we've ever seen it. This is the first time we've ever seen, a black elf or something, or a black Vulcan. There was one in Voyager, so it's been a while since that. It was like 1998, I think. And we're just culture shocking. That's not what's going on. We can't move because what they're doing is robbing the meaning and the distinctiveness and the spirit of the thing that they're trying to sell back to us. And what we're transparently getting is a husk. And they will win, and the old world will die. But in many ways it was dead already, right? In many ways, what's worse than being loyal to something that was always dead? What's worse than thinking that imagine the people who've given their entire lives over to Dungeons and Dragons. Like, they fell in love with Lord of the Rings, and then they thought, oh my God, this is an amazing piece of work. If only more people could see the beauty of this work. And then they go on in their lives and they become Dungeons and Dragons fans and TSR fans and later Wizards of the Coast fans. And they end up in the later part of their lives, and their entire life is organized around like these corporate pieces of intellectual property that are just republished and republished and republished, and time to consume, ring the bell. I mean, that's a much more depressing, and a lot of people went through that trajectory, Ben White, in their entire life. Like, a lot of Generation Xers and Boomers went through that trajectory in their lives. Like, you have the opportunity of going the opposite way. Sure, by the time you're in your 20s, this stuff is ruined. But this is your chance to go from Lord of the Rings to the Ring cycle to Beowulf, to poetry, to the Psalms, to the Gospels, to seeing how you can actually experience what those things were all describing in the real world, and to learn to kind of incorporate a certain amount of poetry in your life, like because this thing died where it was, because the old world died at this stage of your life, we can still turn back and go in a different direction. We're not lost yet. No, not that I think anyone is ever truly lost at least until the moment of their death. But the fact that the world has died around us means that we will not dedicate our lives to something that is dead. And that's, to me, a very optimistic perspective. And it's much better than the slow burn. I mean, imagine... I'm one to talk. I cling to intellectual properties owned by corporations, hoping that, I can have this little entertainment. And I indulge myself in this entertainment product. Oh man, don't take away Warhammer from me or whatever, right? Like I want my grimdark future, right? I want it to be the Dark Ages in space. But I can be under no illusions that this is a portal to something more meaningful, unless I actually make it that, unless we intentionally go in that direction. Glow in the dark for $3. These people live in bureaucracies and managerial environments. Anything outside this is seen as barbaric. They have no connections other than some regulations. If they are married, it will feel that way too. I'm not so sure I understand about the married part. I guess you mean if they're married, it will feel like a bureaucratic connection. I don't know. In some ways, that's the ultimate salvation of the boomers is that they were able to form families. Oops. One moment, guys. Might have some noise disruption. A little bit on topic, I guess. The ultimate salvation of the boomers is they may have hitched their cart to a dying superculture because it seemed still alive when they were there, but they were able to make families and come into contact with something real nevertheless. And so I might exclude people. If you're married and you're raising real children and you have to deal with real people, there's a reality to that can't be bureaucratic. I know progressives that try to manage everything through the lens of their politics, but a lot of those relationships don't last very long, or at least the ones I have seen haven't lasted particularly long. And the people that really are, even the progressives that are able to get a relationship to persist, they help themselves to a certain amount of traditional realism on top of their progressive fantasy politics. So I think that might be that might be an exception. But that's ultimately the reality. I think the education institutions are really, the colleges in particular are really this is really the fault of this. There's an excellent essay. Oh God, I always think of these essays that appear on Skeptical Waves channel. He's an audiobooks channel for the distant right, or for NRX more specifically, but actually almost all right-wing books appear there nowadays. But there's this excellent essay on the history of Stanford and its student organizations. And you can see the path in time from when, if you were a young man in Stanford, you were just doing anything. Like, you were a completely independent individual. You were founding companies. You were like redesigning lakes. You were just taking years off, whatever. And you were encouraged to be this independent, autonomous entity, Promethean. Modern day college experiences are just holding pens. You take the classes, you consume the drugs, you eat the food, you have the meal plan, you engage in sex in exactly the way they prescribe at the through the campus safety centers, and you have your little college experience, and you get your identity on the progressive patchwork, so that you can have your politics and your experience of the world spoon-fed to you through the approved institutions and the approved apparatuses. And this is what, again, high school is to blame, college really is to blame for this. So yeah, the I don't know, that's probably trained a generation of bureaucratically minded young people, and it's really sad to see. Glow in the Dark again for $3. Oh no, that's the same one. Okay. It's continuing. I think these people are just like the most popular modern aristocrat, the most modern artists of elites. They go to explain what their art means. They got to explain what their art means because it has no depth. Good art can be observed and will move you without an explanation. So these people are just like popular modern artists. They have to explain their art, what their art means, because it has no depth. Good art can be observed and will move you without an explanation. I might hard disagree with this. I actually really disagree with this. So, first of all, I'm going to sympathize. A lot of modern art sucks because it just doesn't mean anything. And the explanations are post hoc political statements that are generated by the artists so that they can fetch an optimal price, or that they can get optimal clout inside an art selling community that has obvious ulterior motives into generating things that are actually beautiful. A certain amount, and I say certainly, I should say, the art you see in a museum, a lot of it, and a lot of really good art, and the best art will speak to you even if you have no idea what it is about. However, a lot of art only really comes alive if you have the context for what's going on inside of it. The context of history, the context of the religious story it's depicting, the context of the artist itself who created it. So much stuff that would be utterly meaningless is unlocked by the context in which it's produced. And I was really convinced of this by taking an art history class that, well, I mean, it bridged like medieval and ancient art. And just seeing Greek art and hearing the story of when and where it was produced, I'm thinking of, in particular, I'm thinking of the Dying Gaul, which is a very famous Greek statue of a man who is raising a sword and holding a collapsing woman. Now, it's a beautiful piece of art. You know, it speaks to beauty, and it's obvious that some tragic scene is being depicted, but the relevant feature of what kind of really adds gravitas to this piece of art that you wouldn't know outside of the context of its history is that the man has stabbed his own wife and is being prepared to stab himself because he doesn't want to be captured and held as a hostage by the Greeks. And furthermore, this man is not a Greek but a Gaul, and the people who are depicting him in marble, I think it's a marble statue, are depicting in some sense their enemy in battle. And that this entire sculpture is actually an homage to a defeated enemy that is nevertheless seeking something beautiful in death. You couldn't really grasp the dimensions of that sculpture without knowing the context of all of those things that I just told you. You can't just approach the sculpture and have it speak for itself. You don't know what it's depicting. So I disagree with that just prima facie. But I will sympathize, Glow in the Dark, that this sort of post hoc messaging on top of abstract art is, in our modern world, a complete grift. So I have a lot of super chats, so I'm going to accelerate and move on because, oh my god, I'm really far behind. Okay. Antimatter Bone Crusher. Personally, I think I need to get rid of the questions tab. This is irritating. I had to click 2 places to get these things to appear. Personally, I think the modern routes to post-woke culture is to acknowledge hierarchy and to understand many story arcs are characters going from low to high states or high states to low states. Start there. Well, I mean, that's a method of literary criticism, certainly. Certainly that's, I mean, yeah, I mean, I kind of see what you're saying, Antimatter Bone Crusher. The idea that I don't know, I think that the most important thing is to realize that constraint can be good. I mean, I think that even the wokies acknowledge that there can be narrative story arcs that go from high to low or low to high. Although increasingly, depicting any kind of tragic story is anathema to the woke religion. They can only have positive stories because they're afraid of the idea of tragedy crossing the minds of the people, assured always that they're on the right side of history. But they understand that there are good stories and there are bad stories. They also understand that there are good people or bad people. The entire progressive stack is a hierarchy. So just the existence of hierarchies and its direction in stories is not sufficient to differentiate right-wing fiction from left-wing fiction. What distinguishes right-wing fiction is the idea of constraint and sublimation to a higher order. The idea that the hero or the individual could bow towards a power higher than himself and be made greater for that act, and that this is something that could pose constraints on us outside of simply constraints recognized by the market itself and recognized by sort of the administrative or managerial state. Only when hierarchy expresses that relationship is I think it really is something that can shatter the sort of more staid hierarchies of the progressive stack and kind of the woke agenda. But thank you very much. Ben White for $5. I think creating post-woke works... Wait, didn't I just read that one? Okay, my bad. Oh, I'm sorry. No, so this is a different one. It's just on a very similar topic. I think creating post-woke works for the general audience is not the play right now. Artists should target works for a specific ethnic or religious group. Maybe a tragedy set in Qin, China, or a space opera for trad Catholics. Well, there already are a few space operas for trad Catholics, although I would always welcome another one. Catholic-style space operas, even if you exclude things like Warhammer, are not uncommon. I'm thinking here very prominently of Gene Wolfe's The New Sun trilogy, and the perhaps even more Catholic Canticle for Leibowitz, among some others, I think. Sure, I think I would agree with you, Ben White, but I would I might say about a certain type of culture, not for a certain type of culture. I'm not so sure that in the modern world, I mean, maybe if you sell in China, you're going to sell stories about the China, a tragedy set in Qin Dynasty China to the Chinese people, but I think it's more effective if the subject just is the culture itself. The subject of the culture itself can be relevant even to people who, pardon me 1 minute. It can be relevant to people even if they don't share that culture themselves. Stories by Yukio Mishima or a Tagore's short story, or I'm about to read. I'm trying. This is kind of on my stack, but V.S. Nepal, who is a Hindu Trinidadian author, I think. These people are not from my culture. They don't write about my culture, but I still recognize them as great contributors to understanding the human condition. And so, I think that there is a case for multiculturalism, or even in the patchwork, there is space for like reaching outside your own culture, insofar as the audience is concerned. But given that I have a long way to go in terms of super chats and not very much time, I'm going to hurry on through this. Oh my God, I'm almost at time and I'm not even halfway through. Is that possible? Late Stage Imperium for $3. I've seen it twice now in your discussion with Benjamin Boyce, and another in a petition for female space, and another in a petition for female space marines. The term sensitivity reader, which might suggest the most Orwellian term to come out recently. I never encountered the term sensitivity reader, Late Stage Imperium. Did Benjamin Boyce bring up the idea of the sensitivity reader? I assume you mean the reader that is reading to protect some group from being offended. I take it, but since I haven't heard of that, I can't really answer it very well. But thank you for the super chat, though. Click that one again, I guess. Darth Calhoun. My polyscience class is a final project to write our utopia. I chose the Ghibelline idea of the Holy Roman Empire as my utopia. Do you know any good sources besides Evola on the Holy Roman Empire and Ghibellinism? Not off the top of my head. I mean, like the entire extent of it. My primary source for Ghibelline ideas is Dante Alighieri, which is probably not a good place to start. But the primary sources for, I know Dante was a Guelph, not a Ghibelline, but like he was basically a Ghibelline posting as a Guelph. These are political parties from medieval Europe. But if you're looking for a primary source, his De Monarchia is like that's the one everyone remembers, right? For how the world should work under the Ghibelline worldview, really. And he was a Florentine supporter of the idea that the Holy Roman Empire had sort of a dual mandate to rule the world as the political center of a Christendom. And if you're talking about sort of the medieval Ghibellinism, that might be a good place to start. As for secondary sources, like people who do this like rundown, there was like a history for the later end of this perspective. There was this, I don't remember the author, but there was someone who wrote a great history of the Habsburgs that might be useful. But I don't know. A general medieval history of the Holy Roman Empire would probably suffice. The Holy Roman Empire, I'm not somebody who has, like, I've read histories, but my history book, my bookshelf isn't filled with the top tier choices of like history authors, and oftentimes the people who write the most compelling history aren't the most accurate. Like certainly the most compelling history writer would be someone like, was it Barbara Tuchman, who wrote The Guns of August, but that's sort of full of narrative bullshit that obviously comes from propaganda from that period, and that comes from sort of political understandings of the lessons we can take from World War One that probably aren't very accurate, all things considered. So history is hard that way. I don't know. So I don't know. That's all I can really offer on that question. I'm sorry, Darth Calhoun. The Dashing Rogue for $3 USA. Are we talking about the Neil Cuck Gaiman? The dude is unremarkable. Well, in hindsight, I guess he's unremarkable. It seemed in the 90s like he was the portal to actually recapturing energy and injecting energy into modern fiction, into modern fantasy. Because it seemed like, okay, all these other people are just taking the form of the ancient fantasy, but this is a guy who's actually read history and who wants to incorporate its lessons into compelling contemporary fiction that takes place in the modern world. I mean, what's there not to like? We didn't know back then that this really led nowhere. It led to self-indulgence and a loss of the very past wisdom that his whole style was originally trying to invoke and preserve. Okay, Nathan Woods says, my hunger sleeps in streams and dreams of fish. Very poetic, but I'm not so sure how to answer it, but thank you very much. Maybe a reference to Hunger the Dye Merchant? I don't know. Late Stage Imperium. Anyone seems to hate their company and where they work. Well, it is work because you only do it for being... Well, it is work because you only do it for being paid. The relentless griping and negativity seems like a key to the worker shortage, among other things. Thoughts? I mean, the worker shortage. And this is the problem with economics, is that we're so far afield from what's genuinely healthy that the second you try to point fingers and assign blame or propose solutions, it feels like you're doing something unfair, because everyone's been cheating off of everyone else for so long that you just, laying down a line somewhere feels like you're playing favorites, right? I don't know. They could always, in my opinion, the worker shortage is really just a question of wages. They should pay people more and try to give people living wages to sustain families. I know that this is impossible given our country's irresponsible money printing policies and our irresponsible borrowing, and the fact that our current economy is totally misallocated and untooled for the people we've been training. But that's probably the source of the worker shortage. Insofar as what you're saying about poor working conditions because people are griping and constantly being negative, this is the infusion. I would think a lot of this is due to the atomization of society and the infusion of politics and politicized religions into the workplace. It used to be that, I've only experienced this briefly. It used to be that you were fairly friendly with your coworkers because you were going to be around them for the rest of your life, so you couldn't very well shit where you ate. But these days, people just grind through the workday plugged into their computer with their headphones. And I write code for a living too, just like the next guy. And they don't really interact with their coworkers. They only come in some days, and there are social distancing policies. So when you interact with somebody, why not be politically mean and backbiting? And that's even before we integrate the politics that literally encourages us to be that way. Anyway, I'm going to hurry on through, or I'll never get through with these things. Eric Lefar for $10 USA. Talking to my retired actor friend from Hollywood, the decline in cultural quality is self-evident to everyone, even with the insiders. As progressivism exhausts itself, is there space for right-wing cultural output? i.e. the Daily Wire's 10 million upcoming children's programming. Well, children's programming is easy, and I consider the Daily Wire to be a friend, maybe not a friend, but a non-enemy at minimum, which relative to Hollywood generally is a huge step up. It's good to know that the insiders are starting to feel this, because the last time I talked to anyone on the inside of Hollywood, even the real lower decks that I kind of have contact with, people were completely oblivious to the ideological direction that had enthralled them, and they were full steam ahead on all this stuff. So I'm glad to see that someone else is feeling this, but I don't know. It's weird. The reason why Hollywood has no new ideas is because it's really illegal for them to have new ideas or to go in different directions because of the civil rights regime that's always implicitly ruling them. Whether private entities like the Daily Wire can do something different is still, I think, yet to be seen. It seems like they're doing fairly good business for the most part, but it also feels, for the most part, like they're just doing a rehash of old Hollywood. From what I've seen from the Daily Wire is that they're not doing anything that's really edgy or that's really striking out in a new, bold direction. They're just producing the kind of movies that Hollywood could have produced in the 1980s, which is good. I mean, I'm game. I don't have to have entertainment, but I'd like to have entertainment. And having a competently made movie seems like a good idea to me at this stage. But this is not a new direction for our culture. The Daily Wire and people with deep pockets can't make truly edgy stuff because it's too risky. Like, for instance, let's say that they want to make a movie about, I don't know, let's take an edgy movie that George Lucas made in the 1980s about Yukio Mishima. Let's just say you want to make a Yukio Mishima movie in the present world with like a lot of un-PC things about like race and ethnicity and consensuality and sex and death and suicide. The Daily Wire can't do that because even if they don't cross one of the PC pieties, and Yukio Mishima is not a very PC man, they'll lose the interest of their own conservative funders who won't want a film that glorifies suicide and who won't know what to make of the film to begin with. And that's pretty minimal. That's just to remake a relatively edgy right-wing movie that progressive filmmakers felt they could make in the 1980s. Like, that's nothing. That's not going anywhere near the other third rails of politics that some filmmaker might want to toy with. What if you had what if you had a movie that had nationalist themes in it, with white characters expressing those nationalist themes and being fulfilled by them? That is a emotion that you'll see readily expressed in early 20th century authors. Rudyard Kipling a little bit, going back to something like Swiss Family Robinson and Robinson Crusoe. These are emotions that are distinctly expressed in books like that from the old world. You mix that in the right way in a modern movie, and that will end your career in Hollywood. So for the time being, I think cultural smallness is going to be both the constraint of our palate and also our cultural medium. I don't know if there's any other way. I don't want to be a prophet. I don't want to tell you what to make, but from my perspective, the truly worthwhile is going to be communicated in the small. And I will certainly be a customer of the Daily Wire, well, at least in part, but I probably will not be a fan, if that distinction makes sense to you. Glow in the Dark for $10 USA. Does a flower need to explain its beauty? Do you need a prescription for fresh air? When you laugh at a silly joke, do you need a degree to enjoy it? Is there an expert on how to drink a refreshing glass of cold water on a hot summer day? What bureaucrat was needed for all of these things? Well, yes, in the sense you're absolutely right. You do not need I think you're harping on an emergent theme on this talk here. There is a certain type of art that is deeply connected to reality and the lived moment and the places you can see walking outside your door, the kind of realness that's described in rap music. And that's one of the few very, very true things about rap music, is that it tries to engage realistically with ghetto life and African American existences. And people don't, reactionaries don't give it credit for that, even though it's degraded in a lot of other ways. It has that going for it. But, there is a certain kind of art that's tightly connected to personal experience and reality. And the whole point of it is it does not need to explain itself. That's probably the kind of small art that we need to be cultivating in dissident spaces, because it's the only thing that we're going to be capable of making for the foreseeable future. However, this is not generally true. For the most part and for most times, art requires education to appreciate in its full form. You need to learn the language in order to read the book. You need to have ear training to understand music at a sublime level. People have to be trained by a culture in order to be able to pick up everything that it's laying down, and having things fly over having culture fly over the heads of an audience not prepared or trained to see it is certainly a thing. Guys, don't give me super chats, just FYI if that wasn't clear. I'm way over time, so thank you very much at this stage. Riz for $3 USA. Hi, Dave. C.S. Lewis versus G.K. Chesterton. However, you want to compare them. Started reading their work, and I'd like to know how you think about them as two great Christian writers. Well, I really see them as peas in a pod, to be quite honest. G.K. Chesterton was the precursor of people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis in a lot of ways. He was an early reconvert to Christianity, just like T.S. Eliot. And from these thinkers, you get people like, I don't actually know what their relationship was. They lived during, they both lived during, G.K. Chesterton was in the end of his life in the 30s, and C.S. Lewis was a younger man in the 20s and 30s. But they lived at somewhat the same time, so they might have interacted. I wouldn't know. I don't know that. But their perspectives are very similar. They both use the English tradition to express the deep truths of Christianity in ways that wouldn't necessarily be apparent to modern viewers. As apologists, I prefer Chesterton's orthodoxy to C.S. Lewis's more on-the-nose and explicit explanations of Christian principles. But C.S. Lewis's more on-the-nose approach is more useful for actually answering money questions that stop people from becoming Christians, whereas G.K. Chesterton's work is more about asking the right questions to begin with. It's more about approaching the universe in the right way and having the right frame rather than coming to the right conclusions about those questions. And so for that reason, I might prefer Chesterton. Although I will say C.S. Lewis has probably one of the most important short essays of the 20th century, which is The Abolition of Man, which I do not know what the equivalent of that. You could argue orthodoxy, but The Abolition of Man is something that just needs to be. It's seminal reading for anyone who wants to take the 21st century seriously and the questions that the 21st century provides seriously. Yeah. Although strangely enough, fun fact, did you guys know that Chesterton had a very high voice and that C.S. Lewis had a very deep voice? the exact opposite as what you'd think looking at their pictures, but you can listen to recordings of them, and sure enough, you see that, right? You hear, I should say, you hear that. Glow in the dark. There is nothing outside today's world order. We are at the end of history and time, or so they want us to believe. Oh yeah, that's what Klaus Schwab believes. Klaus Schwab believes that this is the end of humanity. They're about to press the button and start singularity, and we're about to become the pets of AI, and maybe AI will manage us in some kind of zoo or wildlife preserve or something like that. But that's what they think is going to happen, and I think they're full of shit. I don't think there is an AI danger, but for my money, the AI danger is not so much the hard AI danger of something like a Roko's basilisk, but more the soft AI danger of AI existing as both a drug, both an addictive drug, and also an element that constantly confuses us as to what is genuinely human and what is a facsimile of humans. Society Man, hey, how's it going, man? For $5 USA, The Godfather was a popular Machiavellian power politics story, and yet it absolutely nailed the ending in the first and second movies. Traditionally tragic endings still have great power, but George R. R. Martin is undermined by his fixation of undermining Tolkien. I think that's certainly the case. I don't remember the... so the first ending is the one I remember very distinctly from The Godfather. I'm blanking on the ending of the second one. The first ending is literally a succession ending. The king is restored, his son takes the throne, and he establishes his dominance with a hint that he has accepted corruption that was never meant for him. The second one, I believe, is his position as king corrupts him, and he moves from being sort of a monarch to more of a thug. He violates many of his own principles. And, this is something that I guess you could do this. To me, The Godfather really is more of the classic Shakespearean tragic form that I think George R. R. Martin wanted to... he wants a classic Shakespearean tragic ending, I think. And that's probably what he was going for, making the whole Daenerys be evil thing. But the problem is that he lacks... The Godfather was running off the fumes of the previous Christian morality, and it was through that lens by which we judged the Corleone family, and Michael Corleone in particular. In case you're curious, in case the symbolism wasn't lost on you, you can literally hear the Christian morality being pronounced over the climactic scene in the first Godfather. And that's the moral system by which the tragedy proceeds, and by which he both takes the crown of his father and is corrupted by it. This is not, again, the problem... probably some of it's vainglory on the part of George R. R. Martin, that he wants to subvert Tolkien. But the second thing is that the George R. R. Martin can't just fall back on, we're playing by Christian morality, and you should be really concerned that so-and-so murders their brother or murders their people. It's not exactly clear what the ultimate morality is. I guess humanism. We're supposed to, at least in the television show, the movie hopes to kind of convince us that Daenerys' action were a crime against humanism itself, like humanity, human rights. She violated people's human rights and therefore was a bad king or queen or whatever. But that clangs. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel properly medieval or properly... it doesn't properly jive with the tragic dimension of it, and therefore feels kind of forced in hindsight. And I don't know. It also would kind of be more Tolkien-esque, having a Shakespearean tragic ending. Would also kind of be giving in to George R. R. Martin's attempt to deconstruct the fantasy genre, because that would be a trope of the fantasy genre, having a tragic ending. Creeper Weirdo, I've got back from watching Sky Maimon's Shyamalan's. Okay, I've gotten back from watching, I think, M. Night Shyamalan's older work. I saw The Sixth Sense and Unbreakable for the first time, and I need to rewatch Signs. I guess my question is, when did he go wrong? Is it The Village or later? I really want him to make good movies again. Well, see, I watched Sixth Sense, and like everyone else, I liked it. In hindsight, I thought it played. It's just a kind of okay ghost story, I guess. Twist ending aside and all that everyone probably knows by now. 20 something years after it came out, Unbreakable and Signs I thought were good, but they you could see the cracks forming. M. Night Shyamalan didn't understand the subject matter very well. It seemed like he didn't research Christianity or any, and so the whole struggle of faith that should have been the center of Signs felt kind of forced and wrong, and it didn't really. It wasn't entirely bad. I saw what he was going for, and it was really good. It would have been good if he had more competently executed it. And then, I don't know, I'm told it went off the rails because it just went into more and more contrived endings. Unbreakable played better as a story about insanity and believing your own bullshit. And because of that, I thought it was good. And then it being built into sort of a superhero movie was kind of, a little silly. I don't know. I think M. Night Shyamalan is a person that he knows how to do one thing, which is suspense, and he obviously admires Alfred Hitchcock, but he does not know how to actually end a movie in a way that's satisfying for an audience. He has the same problem that most modern directors have, which is he doesn't know, okay, like, what is my audience going to be left with that makes them feel like something has been accomplished, something has been achieved, some statement about the human condition has been expressed. The closest he got with that was, I think, Signs. And even then, like I said, his lack of knowledge about Christian theology and probably talking to real Christian pastors more than a few times has stopped that from being like a really insightful portrayal. I also don't think that he seems to have some like misunderstanding about how the dynamics of plot work, and that constantly trips him up. He doesn't understand when things are getting really, really silly, or when he's broadcasting his twist ending in advance. And because of that, it always feels like he's tripping over his own feet. So, that's my statement on M. Night Shyamalan. And, I don't know how you can go back to making good movies. I guess, like, just beating the average is all right these days. And, he might even be an above-average filmmaker relative to the schlock we have these days. Not that I've seen one of his films for a really long time. Although, wait, I saw that one with that Anya Wide Eyes character. What was it? Split? Yeah, I saw that one, which was okay, I guess. A little bit silly at times. But, there have been worse movies. Do you think the reason... Glow in the Dark for 20. Do you think there are reasons why they won't let franchises lay dormant or in its original state? The reason why they won't let franchises lay dormant or in their original state is because they are on a subconscious level. They can't let there be any conclusions or completions of thought to a story. Like, is it a reflection of their desires to have a problem, never to have a perfect solution, so they can use it for their own desires? Yeah, I guess so. I don't know if that. I'm trying to scan that super chat again. I don't. I think you're kind of overthinking it. To be honest, I think that Hollywood is perfectly fine putting ends on stories. They put an end on the Star Wars prequels, as cringe as it was. I think their desire to keep things open ended is their desire to is basically their desperation for creating new stories. They don't want to make a new story. They want to have a pre-existing audience, and they don't. And I think because if they made a new story, they feel it would reveal something about themselves that would be scary and not politically correct and problematic. And so they mine old stories because not only is it have a pre-existing audience and is low risk, they can create controversy as to the origin of problematic elements. And so they turn what is an artistic problem into a managerial problem. And managerial problems are the problems they like. I think that they want to have an open-ended universe because an open-ended universe is something that they can manage and control and kind of farm as like an ant colony. And that's what these guys like doing. And so they create these things, fictional versions of these things when they can't create them in real life. So that's my opinion about why they always leave the stories open-ended. Not Omegon for $3 USA. I guess you're not Alfarius either. The greatest crime of the modern media is that it is boring. Ah, well, there we go. I think that is I can disagree with that and move right on past my super chats. Okay, but thank you very much, Not Omegon, because I totally agree with that statement. All right, Late Stage Imperium for $3 USA. I think part of the reason they don't get bored is because the continual occupation is indoctrinating. Okay, I think the reason they don't get bored is because their continual occupation is indoctrinating the youth. True believers doing missionary work and new people experiencing it for the first time. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I can kind of see that. Like, what I always say is for a certain kind of person involved in this LGBTQ kind of gender cult deal, you're never done coming out. You always have to be in the process of coming out. You always have to be in the process of reasserting your identity and loyalty to the cathedral, because especially if you're white, right? Because if you're not, then they'll start doubting your loyalty to the system. They'll start thinking, well, maybe you might not be constantly thinking about how you're relevant to us, but also because it's the only interesting part of your journey. Especially for women, a lot of these lesbians who come out as lesbians, they're not defining themselves through orgasm. They're defining themselves through politics. And how do you be politically sexual if you're not having sex? Well, you do that by constantly coming out, constantly making a big deal out of it. And as you're suggesting, that's a good point, by proselytizing the new generation. And it might be old hat to you, but it's new hat to them. And, that makes you feel like you're really doing good in the world. And the mimetic organism that is progressivism takes another scalp and grows in power because it has a new lifetime convert. Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. But that's the reason why there's all these libs. That's why libs of TikTok are a thing, right? Because they have to be broadcasting that they're doing this so that their lives can have some meaning. Yeah, that's a good theory. Maybe I'll give some more thought to it. But given what time it is in the night, I have to continue to go on. And this is a lesson to get your super chats in early because I am way over time. Disappointed optimist. Do you agree? Do you agree, though there is always hope in stories, that narrative that works has to kneecap some progressive ideas no matter how progressive they appear? Utilitarians are still villains, nihilists are still usually rebuked, family and loyalty are still transcendent. Something like Breaking Bad is about the sin of pride. Well, yeah, this is what I was going over. Things that had, things from the last 20 years, cultural pieces from the last 20 years that would kind of still be good, still be wholesome, we would still watch in another 10 years. And Breaking Bad was on that list, along with like Dredd, Judge Dredd from 2012, and there are a few other like gritty, dark ones that might be on the list. And the fact that I'm not remembering them does not really commend them as things that will be remembered, but bear with me. A lot of these sort of things like Breaking Bad, Breaking Bad, it works because it's not a modern story. It's a pre-modern story. It's like an Old Testament story. Man does evil, and the fates return to avenge his evil deed, with more evil being in one season literally rained down from the heavens. And his entire life goes from being a small life of good to being a large act of wickedness. And this is not a modern story. This is an old story. This is an ancient story. And the same thing is true like with these other gritty, dark things. The reason why they're relevant is that they're, because they have these dimensions to them. No Country for Old Men would be another example of a gritty piece of fiction that will carry on. The first thing is that they're classic archetypical stories that have clear moral dimensions to them, if not hopeless ones. The other thing is that they prefigure the sort of third world state we are entering into very quickly. Both No Country and Breaking Bad both do that, and both describe, the sort of southern area of the United States as well. As for the idea that utilitarians are always the villains and nihilism is still rebuked and loyalty is always transcendent, this is true only in sort of the legacy media constructs. You go to something like Steven Universe, and a lot of these ideas are tested. Certainly nihilism in a pure form is detested, and loyalty to some kind of family is considered good. But these express none of the sort of classic perspectives on these questions. That what you get is sort of these ideas of what good ethics are as a sort of utilitarian ethic. And you get these ideas of family and morality filtered through the perspective of the managerial class, filtered through the perspective of the cathedral, and robbed of sort of their core force. You're not getting sort of an Old Testament view of these things, or even a view that would be recognizable in the early 20th century, the way you see it in Breaking Bad. But thank you for the super chat. I will continue on because, again, getting tired and running out of time. Asteroidal Assassin, dear distributist, I have been speaking with a girl over the internet for almost a year now. She's a monarchist and I'm a left-wing anarchist. We both have social conservatism in common. She sometimes gets upset with my political views. How would I be able to handle this without being a simp? I mean, you're a left-wing anarchist, really? I mean, how are you a left-wing anarchist if you're a social conservative? You mean because how does that work? I mean, I guess I might be able to answer this if I understood how your worldview was at all coherent. but I'll try to answer it without knowing how your worldview is coherent. I'd advise you to not be a left-wing anarchist. I don't know how you can be socially conservative and left-wing, but I'll leave it up to you. I'll answer this question in a different way. Well, considering you've been talking to her over the internet, she's not your girlfriend, but I've heard this question brought to me in a different way. What if I suspect that my girlfriend is more based than me, politically? Well, first of all, you know, you probably want to rectify this and not let your girlfriend be more based than you, is my attitude. The second thing is that if she's with you, then probably, you're not a complete pushover. Like, you're embodying right-wing virtues in your personal life. You're embodying traditional ethics in your personal life because that's what attracts women. And you're probably a strong individual or not a weak one. And so the only thing I would say to this is, I don't know. I wouldn't want to don't be like, oh, hey, honey, you're right about politics. So I'm going to change my views to be like you, to be more conciliant. That's not what you want to do. But if you feel tempted towards right-wing ideas, and you will probably be tempted towards right-wing ideas because your wife is pointing to real elements of reality, that's a little bit redundant. Your wife is pointing to real elements of your own life and asking you to respond politically the same way she knows you'd respond as a man in relationship to your own family. Really, you can't get more right-wing by just applying at a macrocosmic level the same principles you'd use to defend your family, which would start with your wife, which hopefully is the role that your girlfriend is trying out for. So really, when a woman is more right-wing than you, and you've won her approval, really, I would perceive it just as a request to be as caring, defensive, considerate, and firm at the macrocosmic and public level as you are certainly compassionate, firm, and caring with her on a personal level. And if you embody those principles justly and reflect them out as you reflect them in, your politics is going to move right. Nothing makes people more right-wing than having children or getting married, and you'll probably discover this, your socially conservative left-wing anarchism notwithstanding. Dreadnought for $5. What is the Nicklandian zombie apocalypse? I've read more Garvin than Land by far. So this comes from the Dark Enlightenment. Nick Land glosses over this very quickly, as is Nick Land's style. But he draws out a thread that he perceives coming from Garvin's work, and he kind of sharpens it a little bit. And what Nick Land says is that inside political systems, there are feedback loops. There are people do things and then they get the consequences for their action, and they learn and they stop doing socially destructive actions. However, what happens in democracy and managerialized democracy of the type that we are experiencing right now is that the feedback loops are lengthened to the point where you can't see the consequences of your actions. They're collectivized and they're hidden behind veils. So you do all sorts of socially destructive things and you never get any consequences. And because of that, you're encouraged to do more socially destructive things, which of course creates more problems for society and so on and so forth. And so what happens is, and of course, as we know from broken windows theory, when people see people doing self-indulgent, narcissistic, and self-destructive things around them, they respond by becoming more narcissistic and selfish themselves. It's a feedback loop. And so what happens is this feedback loop creates more people who are selfish, high time preference, and whose only thought is to consume in the moment. And Nick Land calls the apex of this consume everything at the moment, save nothing for the future, me, forget about civilization as a whole. he analogizes these people to zombies. And if you go to a major American city and see the indigent drug users that have taken up most of the downtown area and a lot of places, you will be physically reminded of zombie movies from John Carpenter movies. And so that in a nutshell is the Nicklandian idea of the zombie apocalypse. Okay, Pac-Man Respecter for $5. In many words, as $5 is worth, could you give me a point or two, an explanation of Nickland's diagnostics of modernity and its solutions? That stream with Uber Soy and several others was incomprehensible to me, beyond accelerate the decay intentionally. Well, you're not really, my words are not limited by the money, Pac-Man Respecter. It's limited by the time I have and the energy I have to answer them. Given that I've tried as best I can with the previous questioner to summarize what Nickland's zombie apocalypse is, I will say that Nickland does not explicitly provide any solution to this problem that we can possibly foresee. He thinks that the only way to destroy this thing is for there to be some kind of cultural apocalypse. The first one is that the zombies created by the feedback loops that just consume everything they possibly can and destroy everything for the future. They'll literally bring society down to its knees and we'll have like a reset of some kind, like a primitivist reset. Nick Land proposes towards the end of the Dark Enlightenment and further on, he implies that this is the case, that he thinks that the possibility could be to get beyond carbon-based life towards AI and to have sort of cybernetically enhanced neo-humanity that somehow won't play by the same rules as humans, the gumball grabbers that they are, and because they have such different rules and such different incentives, they'll be able to exit the process and they'll be able to right the ship and fix the problem of civilization destroying itself. For reasons that I mentioned before, I consider this to be I don't think this is likely to happen. I don't think it's likely to happen that like we're going to reach some kind of singularity where the rules are radically different. And even if we do develop a cybernetic humanity, and in some sense we already have with things like the iPhone, it's very apparent to me, at least, that they're subject to the same kind of perverse incentives that the ordinary 100% carbon-based humans are subject to. And as such, the vicious cycle, the dance of death to civilizational collapse Nick Land describes is not really interrupted by this process of technological acceleration. So I want to describe Nick Land's solution, but I'm afraid I can't do so charitably, Pac-Man Respecter, because I either think he doesn't have a solution, or I think that the solutions he proposes aren't going to happen or are non-solutions. So thank you very much. I'm going to go on. Glow in the Dark for $5. You're like, give me a summary of a seminal author in 5 minutes at the end of a stream. Glow in the Dark for $5. Everything should be for everyone. Everything should be for everyone doesn't exist nor has ever been that way. The only things we usually have that is the same is usually shallow things or vices. Only particular people for particular things will continue on. Okay, guys, you're killing me with the grammar on this one. That needs some. I understand that with super chats, you guys are paying for commas, and you guys are paying for proper nouns rather than pronouns, but this is a little hard to parse. Yeah, I mean, what we are basically saying, glow in the dark, though, translating is, we can't give everything to everyone, and we can't homogenize culture. And one particular thing particular things for particular people will continue on. I believe that's the case. Our global leaders don't believe that's the case. We're placing our bets, and the future will tell us who's right and who's dead. And maybe, maybe we are both wrong, and Nick Land is right, and we'll all be consumed by zombies or by the singularity, which is probably not going to happen. Thomas Cortese for $3. Dave, you should check out the author by the name of Tim Powers. I consider his modern writings a tradcath deconstruction of Gaiman's type of fantasy. He also gives a very bleak look at California. Well, I'll certainly be interested in checking out him, but as this is a recommendation, I will just thank you for it and move on. Jake Lennon for $10. Waifus are modern succubi. Kill your waifu, save your eternal laifu. Thank you. Kill your waifu, save your eternal laifu. The Neo-Catholic Church is here for to save the otakus. Thanks for the last few insightful streams, Dave. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, guys, I know I said this. Maybe I should have said this to Fritz. You guys got to kill the thirst trap stuff. It's not a good look. Thirst for men, like women don't want to know what your taste in women is. Women want to experience your desire for them like it's a bolt of lightning, like it just came out of nowhere, like it's the mysterious act of an unknown god that happens hopefully just to them, right? That's no one wants to know men's sexual preferences, and as such, fictional depictions of your ideal wife prominently displayed are really, really cringe. And no amount of reposting them proudly is going to make them less cringe. They're just really cringe, and they to everyone who's not you, they transparently remind you of the gender cult people. Nobody wants you to define yourself by your sexuality. Men do not define themselves by their sexuality. That's not something that is a good look at all. The people who that message is for aren't going to believe me, so I'll just move on, right? Because I've been saying that for 5 years, and just crickets, right? TN 1000. Again, there's actually a term for what you're talking about with anime. It's called the cult of cute. There's an anime director called Satoshi Kon, RIP, and he hated it. His most prominent work was Paranoia Agent. Simply put, Japan will not grow up. Well, it's going to grow old before it grows up, but the cult of cute is sort of the way of super effeminacy. And it obviously installed itself in Japan. The question is, can it install itself in the United States? Again, obviously this can't go on because it's destroying society's birth rates with low T men. But it seems like the United States will be less fertile soil for it, but it still will probably sprout a little bit before the whole thing kills itself off. But I see no point in playing into this. And again, like, thirst trapping is just part of that. Just don't do it. I don't know. I can't emphasize it enough. Asteroidal Assassin for $10 USA. I'm writing a story where the main character was going to become a villain, but I realize that's hopeless. I'm exchanging a good lesson for a funny villain moments, so I changed my plans, so now he learned to be a hero again, and the story improved. Why do writers hate that convention of heroes these days? Like people who learn lessons? I don't know. Do you mean like... Okay, so I think so you're saying you're writing a story where a hero becomes a villain, and you're changing the story again, so a hero does something bad and learns his lesson. Asteroidal Assassin, the reason why people don't like I learned my lesson stories is because they smack of children's fiction. I learned my lesson stories are the reason why. So I'm not saying you can't write a good story like this. There have been many stories where people learn lessons and become heroes again, and all that's very good, and you can write very good ones like that. I'm blanking on a story that works like that off the top of my head, but sure enough, it's there. I'm sure Robinson Crusoe might be one, but the reason why authors don't like it is because it smacks of young adult fiction and children's fiction, where that's a common trope. And it's the same reason why modern artists don't like representational art, is because everyone's afraid of being Thomas Kincaid and of making a career of making kitsch art that's bought by tourists. In the same way, all authors are really afraid of making non-serious, cute little messages that feel like they're very self-affirming, or at least it was until the rise of the Mary Sue and young adult fiction. In which case, I think you'll see a lot of this. Oh, I just learned my lesson and became a better person type fiction. But usually with a female protagonist, right? And a female author on top of that. Okay, thank you very much for the question, though. Glow in the Dark for $3. Do you think the reason most cultural stagnation is happening is that things keep being turned into products and not something more personal? I mean, I would replace that with cultural stagnation is things are more personal than they've ever been. The reason why there's cultural stagnation is because there being the cultural output of a given text is products and not something that is like actually real. I don't know if I mentioned this in. I meant to cover this in the original monologue, but I got distracted. But think of like Lord Byron. So Lord Byron read all of these poems about ancient Greece and these great heroes, and the guy in the middle of writing poems literally went to Greece, to these islands, and then subsequently after going to Greece started fighting in the Greek Civil War against the Turks, or the Greek rebellion against the Turks, and I think died very early on of a disease, and like yellow fever or something like that, maybe tuberculosis or whatnot. And after he died, like lots of people followed him in his footsteps because they were fans of his poetry. And you'd have examples of early romantic women like drowning themselves in rivers because they were trying to be like Ophelia or something like that. These are stupid examples of people LARPing to deadly consequence. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is that it's important to understand that until very recently, and you can see this like Jack Kerouac, until very recently, oftentimes young people would take fiction they admired, and what they would try to do is they tried to live it out in their lives rather than adopting it as sort of like this fan identity and then buying a lot of products with that brand on it. That's what they would try to do. And that's living the messages from your media is really what we should be trying to do rather than subscribing and waving a banner around based on your cultural consumption habits. And that's how I might correct that statement. Okay, I hope it's the second to last one. Okay, Aristocratic Owl. This is the last of the questions, right? Aristocratic Owl, could you have a discussion stream with my friend Outreamer about the state of the right wing and discuss what our current current best practical options for the future? I sure. Do I know Outreamer? I feel like I do. Was he at the Sildings conference? Yeah, absolutely. If you can send me a telegram with his contact information, I'll put him on the list. I think the next one I'm streaming with is the Franklin, and hopefully I'll be coming to, and then after that Sargon again, I think. But I have a lot of stream requests for some strange reason. I don't know. I guess let people like hearing me talk on streams. Aristocratic owl. Last one. Thank God. God be praised. And I mean that sincerely. Aristocratic owl for $3 USA. I think to a certain degree, you can't reverse the fact that today's society is feminine. And I think the time for He-Man masculinity is dead. And MGTOW killed it. Why would MGTOW kill it? MGTOW isn't a particular masculine movement. Maybe the pickup artist people killed it. I like to think that a lot of the Bronze Age pervert guys put their money where their mouth is and actually become more masculine. Really, aristocratic owl. I think I think people just need to try to take the stuff they consume, the fiction they consume, the media they consume, and see how they can actually express this in a real world context. I think that's the step that we need to try to take now. I hear an European VMaker say that entropy screwed up my chat again. I'm sorry to hear that, but since I'm at the end of the chats, I am very eager to close out this live stream because I'm way over time. And I will finish with a poem. Tonight's poem is, if you recognize this, the first stanza posted in the chat during the monologue, is William Wordsworth's The Solitary Reaper. Behold her single in the field, yon solitary highland lass, reaping and singing by herself. Stop here or gently pass. Alone she cuts and binds the grain, and sings a melancholy strain. Oh, listen, for the vale profound is overflowing with the sound. No nightingale did ever chant more welcome notes than weary bands of travelers in some shady haunt among Arabian sands. A voice so thrilling ne'er was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas among the farthest Hebrides. Will no one tell me what she sings? Perhaps the plaintive number flows for old and happy far-off things and battles won long ago. Or is it something more humble lay, familiar matter of today, some natural sorrow, loss, or pain that has been and may be again? Whatever is the theme the maiden sang, as if her song could have no end, I saw her singing at her work, and over the sickle bending. I listened motionless and still, and I mounted up the hill. The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more. A nice little song from the poet Wordsworth. And with that, my friends, I will have to wish everyone a very good night and a good rest of the week.